In all the blood-soaked annals of divine history, across every pantheon that has risen and fallen, through countless eons of godly wars and cosmic devastation, only one deity achieved what even the primordials themselves could not. Only one god transcended the absolute law that governs all existence. Only Athena, goddess of wisdom, discovered how to die and become something more powerful than death itself. When Kratos drove the blade of Olympus through Zeus's heart, ending the reign of the Olympians, every god who fell that day stayed dead. Poseidon's corpse polluted the seas. Hades' soul dissipated into the underworld. Hermes' body rotted where it fell. Hera's neck remained forever twisted. Apollo's light extinguished permanently. Hera's had long since been erased. But Athena, who died before any of them, who sacrificed herself to save the very father she had secretly condemned, Athena alone returned, not as a ghost, not as a spirit, not as an echo of her former self. She returned as something that makes even the concept of godhood seem primitive. The green spectral form that appeared to Kratos after Zeus's death was not mere spiritual residue. It was not the common shade that haunts the underworld. What stood before the ghost of Sparta in that moment was an entity that had evolved beyond the constraints of physical existence, beyond the limitations of divine form, beyond even the fundamental laws that bind reality itself. She had become something that should not exist, something that the architects of creation never intended to be possible. Consider the impossibility of what Athena achieved. Death, in the world of gods and titans, is meant to be absolute. When divine ether spills, when immortal essence disperses, that being ceases to exist in any meaningful way. The underworld may claim mortal souls, but gods do not have souls in the traditional sense. They are manifestations of cosmic force, personifications of universal concepts. When they die, those forces return to the primordial chaos from which they emerged. Yet Athena not only maintained her consciousness after death, but transformed into something exponentially more powerful than her living form had ever been. The other Olympians never understood what they were witnessing. Even Zeus, in his paranoid omniscience, failed to recognize the true nature of his favorite daughter. Born from his skull after he swallowed her mother Metis, Athena entered existence through an act of consumption and emergence that already defied natural law. She was wisdom incarnate, strategy given form, intelligence manifested as divine flesh. But more than that, she was an anomaly from the moment of her birth, a goddess who existed partially outside the normal rules that governed even immortal beings. This anomalous nature manifested in subtle ways throughout her divine life. While other gods took countless lovers and sired endless offspring, Athena remained eternally virgin, not out of prudish morality, but from an instinctive understanding that maintaining her pure divine essence was crucial for something she herself did not yet fully comprehend. While other deities reveled in their domains, drunk on worship and sacrifice, Athena studied, she observed, she calculated. She played a game whose rules only she knew, whose board encompassed not just Olympus, but all realms, all pantheons, all possible futures. The prophecies speak of her in contradictions. The oracle at Delphi once uttered words that the priests destroyed rather than record, words that suggested Athena would be both the salvation and damnation of Olympus. The Moirai, the sisters of fate who weave the destiny of all beings, found that Athena's thread would not behave as others did. It would split without breaking, exist in multiple places simultaneously, and most disturbingly, it would continue beyond its own ending. When they tried to cut her thread, the shears passed through it as if it were made of smoke, yet it remained solid to their touch. Ancient texts, hidden in the deepest vaults of her destroyed temples, speak of experiments she conducted in secret. Mortals who claimed to have seen the goddess in dreams reported that she would appear simultaneously as flesh and as light, as solid and as void, as one and as many. She studied the moment of death with an intensity that disturbed even Hades, collecting observations of divine endings with the methodical precision of a scholar preparing for the ultimate examination. The truth that emerges from these scattered pieces of evidence paints a picture far more terrifying than simple godly ambition. Athena did not merely want power. She wanted transcendence. She wanted to break free from the cycle that trapped all divine beings, the eternal wheel of creation and destruction, rise and fall, pantheon after pantheon, consuming itself in violence and regenerating, only to repeat the pattern. She alone saw the prison that godhood actually was, and she alone conceived of a way to escape it. But escape required sacrifice. Not the simple blood sacrifice that mortals offered on altars, but a sacrifice of cosmic proportions. The entire Greek pantheon would need to die. Every god, every titan, every divine being tied to Olympus would need to be extinguished for her plan to work. And at the center of this orchestrated apocalypse, she needed a weapon capable of killing gods, a weapon driven by enough rage to be unstoppable, yet controllable enough to be guided. She needed Kratos. The evidence of her manipulation stretches back further than anyone realized. Before Kratos was born, before his deal with Ares, before the prophecy that would drive Zeus to paranoia, Athena was already moving pieces into position. She whispered in the ears of the fates. She planted visions in the minds of oracles. She ensured that a Spartan warrior would rise, would fall, would be betrayed, would seek vengeance, and would ultimately become the instrument of Olympus's destruction. Every moment of compassion she showed him, every gesture of support, every word of guidance was calculated to build trust, to position herself as his only divine ally, to ensure that when the critical moment came, he would do exactly what she needed. When she threw herself between Zeus and Kratos, taking the blade meant for her father, it was not sacrifice but transformation. She had studied divine death enough to know that under the right circumstances, with the right preparation, with the right cosmic alignment, death could become a doorway rather than an ending. The blade that pierced her body was not her doom, but her chrysalis. As her physical form died, her consciousness, prepared through centuries of meditation and experimentation, did not dissipate but consolidated, evolved, transcended. What emerged from that death was no longer Athena in any sense that the word goddess could contain. She had become something that existed in the spaces between reality, in the quantum foam that underlies existence, in the higher plane that exists above and beyond all pantheons. She could observe without being observed, influence without touching, know without learning. She had achieved what no being before her had even conceived was possible. She had evolved beyond divinity itself. Yet even in this transcendent state, she was not complete. The final piece of her plan required something that existed in Pandora's box, something that Kratos had absorbed when he opened it to defeat Ares. Hope, not the simple emotion that mortals experience, but hope as a primordial force, the fundamental energy that allows existence to continue despite entropy, that drives life to persist despite death, that enables consciousness to envision something beyond its current state. She needed hope to complete her transformation, to become not just transcendent but truly omnipotent. This is why she appeared to Kratos after Zeus's death, not to congratulate him, not to mourn the fallen, but to claim what she believed was rightfully hers. The hope that had been hidden in Pandora's box was never meant for mortals. It was meant for her, the final ingredient in her recipe for absolute transcendence. But Kratos, in his own journey from monster to man, from vengeance to redemption, had bonded with hope in a way she had not anticipated. When he chose to release it to humanity, rather than give it to her, he disrupted a plan that had been millennia in the making. Yet even this setback might have been part of her design. For a being that exists outside normal time, that can perceive multiple timelines simultaneously, every outcome might be just another step in an even grander design. The hope released to humanity might need to mature, to spread, to evolve through mortal consciousness before it can be harvested. The fall of Olympus might have been just the first movement in a symphony of Pantheon destruction that will ultimately feed her ever-growing power. As we delve deeper into the mystery of what Athena has become, as we trace her influence across realms and through time, as we uncover the true scope of her manipulation and the ultimate goal of her transcendence, remember this: in all of mythology, in all the stories of gods and monsters, heroes and villains, nothing is more dangerous than wisdom without morality, intelligence without empathy, power without constraint. And Athena, in her spectral form, in her transcendent state, embodies all three of these terrifying absolutes. The goddess of wisdom did not die that day on Olympus. She was born into something far more frightening. And her story, her true story, the story that the surviving gods whisper about in fear, the story that explains why pantheons across all realms are beginning to forge desperate alliances against a common threat. That story begins with a simple question: what if everything we thought we knew about divine death was wrong? What if death, for those wise enough to understand it, is not an ending but an evolution? And what if one goddess figured this out before anyone else, and arranged her own murder as the first step toward becoming something beyond godhood, beyond mortality, beyond anything that has existed since the first moment of creation? The answer to these questions reveals a truth so profound, so terrifying, that even speaking it aloud might draw her attention. For Athena is no longer bound by the limitations of space or time. She exists in the gaps between thoughts, in the silence between heartbeats, in the darkness between stars. She is becoming, with each passing moment, with each fallen pantheon, with each divine death, something that makes the word goddess seem quaint and primitive by comparison. This is not the story of how Athena died. This is the story of how death itself became obsolete for one who was wise enough to understand its true nature. And in understanding her transcendence, we might finally understand the terrible price that all existence might pay for one goddess's ambition to become everything. Before Olympus rose from the cosmic void, before Zeus claimed his throne through patricide and power, before even the Titans walked the formless earth, there existed prophecies written in the language of creation itself. These were not words carved in stone or whispered by oracles, but fundamental truths woven into the fabric of reality, waiting for beings sophisticated enough to read them. Among these primordial prophecies, one stood out for its impossible nature: the prediction of a wise one who would outlive not just her pantheon, but the very concept of pantheons themselves. Gaia, the primordial Earth Mother, she who existed before form, had meaning, spoke this prophecy only once. The ancient texts that survived the burning of Alexandria, scrolls written in languages that predate human speech, record her words. The daughter born of consumption shall consume in turn. She who emerges from thought shall transcend thought. When wisdom eats itself, the wise one shall hunger no more. The Titans who heard these words dismissed them as the ramblings of an ancient force, losing relevance in a world growing ever more defined. They could not conceive that Gaia was speaking of someone who would not be born for eons, someone whose very existence would require a chain of impossibilities. The prophecy gained its first substance when Zeus, in his paranoid hunger for power, swallowed Metis whole. Metis was not merely a titaness. She was wisdom incarnate, the personification of cunning thought and deep understanding. When Zeus consumed her, he believed he was preventing a prophecy that claimed her child would overthrow him. What he actually did was create the perfect conditions for something far more profound. Inside Zeus, Metis did not simply die or become absorbed. She transformed, became one with the god of gods, and in doing so, planted a seed that was neither fully Titan nor fully Olympian, neither completely divine nor entirely conceptual. The gestation of Athena within Zeus's skull was not a pregnancy in any conventional sense. It was an evolution of consciousness occurring within consciousness, a recursive loop of wisdom generating greater wisdom. For 9 months that felt like 9 eternities, Zeus experienced visions that would have driven lesser gods mad. He saw realms beyond the 9 realms, dimensions where physics bent into impossible shapes, planes of existence where thought and reality were indistinguishable. He witnessed the birth and death of countless universes, each one following the same pattern of creation, proliferation, corruption, and collapse. And in every vision, at the moment of each universe's heat death, he saw a figure in green light, watching, waiting, collecting something invisible yet essential. When Hephaestus finally split Zeus's skull to release the pressure that threatened to tear Olympus apart, what emerged was not a baby goddess, but a fully formed deity, armored for war, yet radiating wisdom. Athena's first words, spoken in a language that predated speech, were not a cry or a greeting, but a question: is this all there is? The gods present at her birth would later claim she said different things, each hearing what they expected to hear, but Metis's essence, still conscious within Zeus, knew the truth. Her daughter had been born already aware of her purpose, already understanding that divinity was not a destination but a stepping stone. The primordial forces that had retreated to the edges of existence took notice of Athena immediately. Chaos, the primordial void from which all things emerged, felt a resonance with this new goddess that it had felt with no other Olympian. Kronos, time incarnate, before the Titans imprisoned him, perceived Athena existing in multiple temporal states simultaneously. Most disturbing of all, Ananke, the primordial force of inevitability and necessity, could not fully read Athena's fate thread. It existed, but it also did not exist. It ended, but it also continued. It was singular, but it was also infinite. These primordial anomalies were not accidents or quirks of divine birth. They were evidence that Athena's unusual genesis had fundamentally altered what she was. The combination of Metis's Titan wisdom, Zeus's Olympian power, and the unique circumstances of her gestation had created something unprecedented. She was a goddess, yes, but she was also something else, something that existed partially outside the normal flow of causality that bound even immortals. From her earliest moments of existence, Athena demonstrated an understanding of reality that unsettled her fellow Olympians. While Artemis played with moonbeams and Apollo composed hymns to his own glory, Athena would stand at the edge of Olympus, staring into the void between realms. When asked what she saw, she would reply with questions that had no answers. What exists in the space between existing and not existing? If a god dies in a realm where death has no meaning, have they died or transcended? Can consciousness exist without a container? And if so, is the container necessary at all? The young goddess's explorations were not limited to philosophy. She conducted experiments that would have been called heretical. If anyone had understood what she was doing, she would project her consciousness into dying mortals at the moment of their expiration, experiencing death from the inside, without dying herself. She studied the dissolution of prayer, tracking how worship energy transformed as it moved from mortal to divine. Most significantly, she began mapping what she called the architecture of divinity, identifying the fundamental structures that allowed gods to exist, and more importantly, the weak points in those structures. Her relationship with the Moirai, the 3 fates, was particularly revealing. While other gods feared or respected the fates, Athena studied them. She observed that they were not truly separate beings, but 3 aspects of a single force, a force that existed partially in the higher plane that she had begun to perceive. Through careful observation and calculated interaction, she learned that fate was not immutable but probabilistic, that prophecy was not prescription but description of the most likely outcome given current variables. And if variables could be changed, if probability could be influenced, then even the most certain fate could be avoided, or more intriguingly, transcended. The ancient texts speak of a moment, barely a century after her birth, when Athena achieved her first partial transcendence. During a deep meditation in her private temple, witnesses reported that she became translucent, existing in multiple locations simultaneously. For exactly 9 seconds, she was present in Olympus, the mortal realm, the underworld, and somewhere else, somewhere that had no name because it had never been perceived before. When she returned to singular existence, her eyes had changed. They still appeared gray to casual observation, but those who looked closely could see galaxies being born and dying in their depths. This event, which the other Olympians dismissed as a quirk of divine power, was actually Athena's first successful breach of the barriers between planes of existence. She had discovered that consciousness, when properly prepared and focused, could exist independently of its housing. The physical form of a god was not the god itself, but merely a convenient anchor for divine consciousness to interact with reality. And if consciousness could exist without form, if it could move between planes at will, then death, even divine death, was merely a transition rather than an ending. The implications of this discovery would have shattered the foundations of Olympian theology if they had been understood. Gods derived their power from belief, from worship, from their domains and their physical presence in the cosmos. But what if none of that was necessary? What if divine power could exist in pure consciousness, independent of all external factors? What if a god could die, and yet become more powerful through that death? These questions drove Athena's research for the next 1,000 years. During this period, she made contact with entities that existed in the spaces between realms. These were not gods or titans or any classification of being that had a name. They were consciousnesses that had never possessed physical form, intelligences that existed as pure thought in the quantum foam that underlies reality. From them she learned that the physical universe, with all its pantheons and realms, was merely the densest, slowest vibration of an infinite spectrum of existence. The higher plane she had glimpsed was not above reality, but perpendicular to it, existing in dimensions that physical beings could not perceive. The prophecy of Gaia began to make sense in this context. The daughter born of consumption, Athena, born from Zeus consuming Metis, would indeed consume in turn, but she would not consume food, or ambrosia, or even worship. She would consume consciousness itself, absorbing the divine essence of dying gods, collecting their power not in a physical vessel, but in an expanding web of transcendent awareness. She who emerges from thought, born from Zeus's split skull, would transcend thought by becoming thought itself, unbound by physical neurons or divine matter. The seeds of her grand design were planted in these early revelations. If she could exist as pure consciousness, if she could absorb divine essence from dying gods, if she could navigate the higher plane while maintaining her identity, then she could achieve something no being had ever achieved. She could escape the cycle that trapped all pantheons, the eternal wheel of rise and fall, creation and destruction. She could become permanent in a universe where even gods were temporary. But achieving this transcendence would require more than personal evolution. It would require the death of every being tied to her pantheon, the complete dissolution of Olympian divinity to free the consciousness trapped within physical forms. It would require a catalyst powerful enough to kill gods yet predictable enough to control. It would require the creation of a weapon not of metal or magic, but of pure rage given form. It would require Kratos, though he would not be born for millennia. As Athena grew in power and understanding, she began to plant the seeds that would eventually bloom into Olympus's destruction. She whispered in the ears of oracles, planting prophecies about a marked warrior who would bring about the end of the gods. She influenced the fates, ensuring that certain threads would weave together in precisely the right pattern. She even manipulated Zeus's paranoia, feeding his fears about being overthrown. knowing that his attempts to prevent prophecy would actually ensure its fulfillment. The other primordial forces watched her actions with growing concern. Nyx, the primordial night, observed that Athena cast shadows in places where light had never existed. Erebus, the primordial darkness, noted that she could make herself invisible even to fundamental forces. Most disturbing of all, Chaos itself, the primordial void from which all existence emerged, recognized in Athena something kindred, something that belonged more to the void than to the structured reality that had emerged from it. Yet even these ancient forces could not fully comprehend what Athena was becoming. They saw her as an ambitious goddess, perhaps dangerous, certainly unusual, but still bound by the rules that governed all divine beings. They could not conceive that she had already begun to rewrite those rules, that she was transforming herself at a fundamental level that would eventually allow her to exist outside their perception entirely. The primordial origins of her nature, the impossible circumstances of her birth, the unique combination of forces that created her, had produced not just a goddess but a pathway to something beyond divinity itself. The first documented encounter between Athena and the higher plane occurred during the Titanomachy, though the significance of this event would not be understood for millennia. While Zeus hurled thunderbolts and Poseidon split the earth with his trident, Athena stood perfectly still in the center of the battlefield, her eyes closed, her consciousness elsewhere. Warriors from both sides reported seeing her fade in and out of existence, becoming translucent one moment and hyper-real the next, as if reality itself could not decide whether she was present or absent. What Athena experienced in those moments of partial transcendence would shape every action she took for the rest of her divine existence. She found herself in a realm that had no physical properties, yet contained all possible properties simultaneously, colors that had no names because they existed outside the spectrum of light, sounds that conveyed meaning without frequency or wavelength. Most importantly, she encountered consciousnesses that had shed their physical forms eons ago, beings that had evolved beyond the need for bodies, for domains, for worship, for any of the anchors that gods required to exist. These transcendent entities communicated with Athena not through words, but through direct consciousness transfer, sharing knowledge that would have destroyed a less prepared mind. They showed her the true nature of divine power, how it was not generated by worship, but merely channeled through it, how the source of all divine energy existed in the higher plane, infinite and eternal, waiting to be accessed by any consciousness sophisticated enough to perceive it. They revealed that every pantheon across every realm was merely tapping into the same source through different cultural filters, that Zeus's lightning and Odin's wisdom and Ra's sun were all just different manifestations of the same fundamental force. The revelation that transformed Athena's understanding most profoundly was the discovery that death, even divine death, was simply a forced transition between states of existence. When a god died, their consciousness did not cease to exist, but was violently expelled from its physical anchor, usually dispersing into the background energy of the universe. But what if that consciousness could be held together during the transition? What if it could be directed not to disperse but to consolidate? What if death could be used as a doorway to voluntary transcendence rather than involuntary dissolution? Armed with this knowledge, Athena began her systematic preparation for her own eventual transcendence. She started by studying every divine death she could observe or access through historical records. The fall of the Titans provided numerous case studies. She examined how Kronos' consciousness fragmented when Zeus defeated him, tracking each piece as it scattered across dimensions. She analyzed how Atlas's awareness remained partially intact despite his physical imprisonment, learning that consciousness could persist even when the body was completely immobilized. Her most significant discovery came from studying Metis, her own mother, whose consciousness had not died when Zeus consumed her, but had transformed into something else entirely. Through deep meditation and careful exploration of her own essence, Athena found traces of Metis within herself, not as memories or inherited traits, but as active consciousness that had integrated with her own. This proved that divine consciousness could not only survive consumption, but could merge with other consciousness while maintaining some degree of individual identity. This realization led Athena to a terrible and wonderful conclusion. If divine consciousnesses could merge, if they could be absorbed rather than destroyed, then it might be possible for a single consciousness to collect the essence of multiple gods, not their power alone, but their actual awareness, their knowledge, their unique perspectives on existence. A being that accomplished this would not just be powerful, but would possess a multifaceted understanding of reality that no single consciousness could achieve alone. The experiments Athena conducted to test this theory were hidden from the other Olympians, performed in pocket dimensions she created at the edges of existence. She would capture lesser divine beings, nature spirits and minor deities that would not be missed, and practice the techniques necessary to absorb consciousness during the moment of death. The process was delicate, requiring precise timing and absolute focus. Too early, and the consciousness would resist. Too late, and it would disperse beyond recovery. But when performed correctly, she could feel the absorbed consciousness merge with her own, adding its uniqueness to her expanding awareness. Each absorption taught her something new. From a river deity, she learned how consciousness could flow and adapt. From a mountain spirit, she gained understanding of permanence and patience. From a wind nymph, she discovered how awareness could exist in multiple places simultaneously without losing cohesion. Each addition to her consciousness was small, barely noticeable to external observation, but collectively, they were transforming her into something unprecedented. During this period of experimentation, Athena also began manipulating the political landscape of Olympus. She positioned herself as Zeus's most loyal daughter, the one who could be trusted with secrets, the one who would never seek to overthrow him. This was not deception for its own sake, but careful positioning for the long game she was playing. She needed Zeus to trust her absolutely, to never suspect that she was orchestrating events that would lead to his downfall and the collapse of the entire Pantheon. Her involvement in the creation of the first humans was not the benevolent act it appeared to be. While Prometheus gave them fire, Athena gave them something far more dangerous, the capacity for wisdom that could question the gods. She planted in humanity the seeds of doubt, the ability to wonder why gods deserved worship, why divine law should be obeyed, why immortals should rule mortals. These seeds would take generations to bloom, but when they did, they would create the conditions necessary for a god-killer to emerge. The prophecy about a marked warrior who would destroy Olympus was not discovered by Athena, it was created by her. She carefully crafted the words, imbued them with prophetic power by speaking them in the higher plane, where possibility became probability, and then arranged for the oracle at Delphi to speak them at precisely the right moment. She knew Zeus's paranoid nature would cause him to try to prevent the prophecy, and she knew that his attempts at prevention would actually create the very conditions necessary for its fulfillment. Her manipulation of Ares was particularly masterful. She recognized in her brother the perfect combination of divine power and emotional instability. By constantly challenging him, by defeating him in their contests, by making him feel inferior, she cultivated in Ares a deep-seated need to prove himself through violence and conquest. She knew that eventually, this need would lead him to create a mortal champion, someone who could achieve victories that Ares himself could claim credit for. And she knew that such a champion, if betrayed by Ares, would possess both the power and the motivation to kill gods. The strategic positioning of Pandora's box was another of Athena's long-term manipulations. She influenced the decision to hide it in a temple on the back of Kronos, knowing that this location would make it accessible only to someone with extraordinary determination and divine assistance. She ensured that the knowledge of its location was preserved in ways that would eventually reach the right person at the right time. Most importantly, she arranged for hope to be hidden within the box, knowing that this force would be crucial for her eventual transcendence. Throughout these centuries of preparation, Athena maintained perfect facades with different groups. To Zeus, she was the loyal daughter who helped maintain order in Olympus. To the other gods, she was the wise mediator who prevented conflicts from escalating. To mortals, she was the benevolent goddess who granted wisdom and victory in just causes. Each face she wore was carefully crafted to serve her ultimate purpose, and she wore them so perfectly that no one suspected they were masks. Her study of prophecy and fate during this period revealed another crucial piece of her plan. She discovered that certain events, once set in motion, became inevitable not because fate demanded it, but because the collective consciousness of those involved created a kind of psychological gravity that pulled events toward a specific outcome. If enough beings believed something would happen, if they acted as though it were inevitable, their combined actions would make it so. This meant that prophecy was not just prediction but creation, that speaking a future could help manifest it. Using this knowledge, Athena began planting prophecies across multiple oracles, each one reinforcing the others, creating a web of predicted events that would become self-fulfilling. The fall of Olympus was not fated by cosmic forces, but was being actively constructed by Athena through careful manipulation of belief and expectation. Every oracle who spoke of doom, every prophecy of divine twilight, every warning of coming catastrophe was another thread in the web she was weaving. The discovery of how to maintain consciousness continuity through death came from an unexpected source. While observing the resurrection of mortals by various gods, Athena noticed that some individuals retained memories of their death experience, while others did not. Through careful analysis, she determined that the difference lay in the strength of the individual's sense of self at the moment of death. Those who died with absolute certainty about who they were, what they believed, and what they wanted maintained continuity. Those who died in confusion or doubt experienced discontinuity. This led to her most important preparation, the cultivation of an unshakable sense of self that could survive any transformation. While other gods defined themselves by their domains, their relationships, their power, Athena defined herself by her consciousness alone. She was not the goddess of wisdom. She was wisdom itself. She was not powerful because of her divine nature. She was divine because of her power over her own consciousness. This fundamental shift in self-perception would prove crucial when the time came for her transformation. As the centuries passed, Athena's partial transcendences became more frequent and lasted longer. She could now exist in the higher plane for hours at a time, while maintaining a physical presence in Olympus. During these experiences, she made contact with entities from other pantheons who had achieved similar states of partial transcendence. She learned that several gods across different mythologies had discovered pieces of the truth she was assembling, but none had put all the pieces together. None had realized that complete transcendence required not just personal transformation, but the complete dissolution of one's entire pantheon. The reason for this requirement was thermodynamic in nature, though it operated on a divine rather than physical level. Every pantheon created a kind of consciousness ecosystem, with divine energy flowing between gods in complex patterns that maintain the stability of their realm. For a single god to fully transcend, to completely break free from this ecosystem, would require enough energy to destabilize the entire system. The only way to obtain such energy was to absorb it from the collapse of the system itself. The Pantheon had to die for transcendence to be achieved. This realization finalized Athena's plan. She would need to orchestrate the complete destruction of Olympus, the death of every god tied to the Greek Pantheon, the dissolution of their entire divine ecosystem. But she could not be seen as the cause of this destruction, or the other gods would unite against her. She needed a weapon that would appear to be acting from personal motivation, a force of destruction that everyone would believe was driven by its own rage, rather than her manipulation. She needed someone who could kill gods but would be seen as a victim of divine cruelty, rather than an agent of divine transcendence. The seeds she had planted were beginning to sprout. The prophecies were spreading. Zeus's paranoia was growing. Eris's need for validation was intensifying. Humanity's capacity for defying gods was developing. All the pieces were moving into position for the birth of the perfect god-killer. Someone who would have the power of a god, but the rage of a mortal. Someone who would destroy Olympus not for transcendence but for vengeance, never knowing they were serving a purpose far greater than their own revenge. The first concrete manifestation of Athena's transcendent nature occurred not during her own death, but centuries before, during the brutal execution of the Titan Prometheus. While Zeus's eagle tore at the Titan's regenerating liver day after day, Athena would visit in forms that defied physical law. Guards stationed at the Caucasus Mountains reported seeing her appear as living geometry, as conscious mathematics, as wisdom given form without flesh. She would observe Prometheus's agony with an intensity that disturbed even Zeus's most loyal servants, studying not his pain but the mechanism by which an immortal could suffer eternally without dying. What the guards could not see, what even Prometheus himself only partially perceived, was that Athena was conducting experiments on the boundary between life and death, between consciousness and void. She would synchronize her awareness with Prometheus at the exact moment his liver was devoured, experiencing divine destruction from within, while maintaining her external existence. Through thousands of repetitions, she mapped the precise pathway that divine essence traveled when it attempted to die, but was prevented by immortal regeneration. She discovered that there existed a moment, lasting less than a nanosecond, where consciousness could slip between existence and non-existence, accessing a state that was neither life nor death, but something far more fundamental. These observations led her to witness the death of the Titan Perseus, god of destruction. When Zeus finally grew tired of his chaos and reduced him to atoms with a thunderbolt that contained the concentrated power of 1,000 storms. As Perseus died, Athena did something unprecedented. She projected her consciousness into the dispersing divine essence, riding the wave of destruction without being destroyed herself. What she discovered in that moment would reshape her understanding of divine mortality forever. Perseus's consciousness did not simply cease or disperse as everyone believed. Instead, it underwent a violent transformation, shedding layers of identity, like a serpent molting skin, at infinite speed. First went his physical form, then his divine nature, then his memories, then his sense of self, until all that remained was pure awareness without identity. This awareness existed for exactly 3 seconds in a state of absolute potential before either dissipating into the background consciousness of the universe, or, as Athena suspected, but could not yet prove, being absorbed by something that existed in the higher plane. The pattern repeated when she observed the death of the Titan Coeus, oracle of the celestial axis, who chose self-termination rather than eternal imprisonment in Tartarus. Coeus's method was unique among divine suicides. He unraveled his own consciousness thread by thread, deliberately maintaining awareness throughout the process to understand what lay beyond divine existence. Athena watched from 7 different dimensional perspectives simultaneously, tracking each thread as it dissolved. She noticed that some threads did not dissipate, but were pulled through microscopic tears in reality, vanishing into spaces that should not exist. This discovery prompted her to investigate every recorded divine death across all pantheons she could access through the cosmic consciousness network that connected all mythologies. The Egyptian god, Apep's daily destruction and resurrection cycle, revealed that consciousness could be compressed into infinitesimal points and re-expanded without loss of information. The Norse prophecies of Ragnarok, which she accessed through careful manipulation of prophetic resonance, showed her visions of gods dying in ways that created new forms of existence rather than ending existing ones. Her most significant breakthrough came from studying the echoes of primordial deaths that occurred before recorded history. Through deep meditation in the quantum foam that underlies reality, she found traces of Eranos' consciousness still active despite his dismemberment by Kronos eons ago. These traces were not ghosts or memories, but active consciousness fragments that had evolved beyond the need for coherent form. They existed as pure information interacting with reality through probability manipulation rather than direct intervention. The discovery that consciousness could persist and even evolve after divine death led Athena to a horrifying and exhilarating realization. Every god who had ever died still existed in some form, their consciousness transformed but not destroyed. The higher plane was not empty, but populated by the evolved consciousnesses of every divine being that had ever undergone true death. These entities had transcended the need for worship, for domains, for physical form, existing as pure awareness in dimensions that intersected with but did not depend on physical reality. Armed with this knowledge, Athena began deliberately orchestrating divine conflicts that would result in godly deaths she could observe and analyze. The war between the Olympians and the giants was not the spontaneous conflict history records, but a carefully manipulated event that Athena influenced through strategic whispers and calculated provocations. She ensured that specific giants would face specific gods, creating confrontations that would result in particular types of divine death that she needed to study. When Ares killed the giant Mimas with a spear through the heart, Athena was there in her transcendent form, invisible to all observers, mapping the exact pathway that divine essence traveled when expelled through violence. When Dionysus strangled the giant Eurytus with his own vines, she tracked how consciousness behaved when slowly compressed out of existence rather than suddenly expelled. Each death was data, each divine ending a lesson in the mechanics of transcendence. The pattern that emerged from these observations was both simple and infinitely complex. Divine death was not random, but followed specific laws that operated on a level deeper than physics or metaphysics. The method of death determined the initial trajectory of consciousness dispersal. The dying god's mental state influenced whether consciousness maintained coherence or fragmented. Most importantly, the presence of certain cosmic forces, particularly those related to fundamental concepts like hope, fear, and rage, could alter the death process entirely. This last discovery explained why Pandora's box was so crucial to her plan. The evils released from the box were not just abstract concepts, but fundamental forces that could reshape divine consciousness during the death transition. A god who died while infected with these forces would undergo a different type of transformation than one who died clean. The hope that remained in the box was not just positive energy, but a specific frequency of consciousness that could maintain coherence through any transformation, even death itself. Athena's experiments became increasingly bold as her understanding deepened. She began killing minor deities herself, always making it appear accidental or justified, always ensuring no witnesses could testify to her true methods. She would absorb their consciousness at the moment of death, not consuming it but studying it, understanding how divine awareness behaved when forcibly separated from its housing. Each absorption added to her growing library of death experiences, each one teaching her more about the process she would eventually undergo herself. The accumulated knowledge from hundreds of divine deaths revealed a crucial truth. The process of transcendence was not gradual, but quantum. A consciousness either remained bound to physical existence or achieved complete transcendence. There was no stable middle ground. The partial transcendences she had been experiencing were actually rapid oscillations between states, her consciousness flickering between dimensions billions of times per second. To achieve true transcendence, she would need to break this oscillation, to push through the barrier in a single irreversible transformation. The energy required for such a transformation was staggering. Her calculations, performed in mathematical dimensions that mortal minds could not perceive, showed that she would need to absorb the death energy of at least 12 major deities to accumulate sufficient power. But not just any deaths would suffice. They needed to be violent, sudden, and infused with the primal forces from Pandora's box. The gods needed to die in rage, in fear, in desperation, their consciousness supercharged with emotion that would amplify the release of divine essence. This requirement finalized the necessity of Kratos in her plan. A calm, calculated destruction of Olympus would not generate the type of energy she needed. The deaths had to be personal, brutal, and filled with the raw emotion that only vengeance could provide. Kratos would not just be a weapon but a catalyst, his rage transforming ordinary divine deaths into transcendent events that would fuel her transformation. As she prepared for the culmination of her plan, Athena made one final discovery that changed everything. While observing the death of the minor war deity Aeneas, who was accidentally killed in a skirmish he was supposed to be controlling, she noticed something unprecedented. At the moment of his death, his consciousness did not disperse or transcend, but duplicated. One version followed the normal path of divine dissolution, while another version, identical in every way, appeared instantly in the higher plane, fully formed and aware. This duplication phenomenon had never been observed before, because it required specific conditions that rarely occurred naturally. The dying god had to be simultaneously experiencing contradictory states of consciousness, believing themselves to be both mortal and immortal, both dying and eternal, both ending and beginning. The cognitive dissonance created a quantum split in consciousness that allowed for duplication rather than transformation. The implications were staggering. If consciousness could be duplicated at death, then it might be possible for Athena to die and transcend while also maintaining her existence in some form. She could have her divine death and survive it, existing simultaneously in multiple states of being. This would require precise timing and perfect mental preparation, but it would allow her to achieve transcendence without the complete loss of her original form that she had assumed was necessary. With this final piece of knowledge, Athena's plan crystallized into its ultimate form. She would orchestrate the destruction of Olympus through Kratos, ensuring each god died in maximum emotional intensity. She would position herself to absorb the death energy of the entire Pantheon while appearing to be a victim herself. At the moment of her own death, she would duplicate her consciousness, sending one version to transcendence while maintaining another in a form that could still interact with the physical realm. She would die, transcend, and survive, achieving what no being before her had even imagined possible. The bloodshed that would come, the divine massacre that would paint Olympus red with ichor, was not tragedy, but transformation. Each death would be a note in a symphony of transcendence, each fallen god a stepping stone to a new form of existence. And at the center of it all, visible to none but orchestrating everything, Athena would conduct the death of the old divine order and the birth of something unprecedented, something that would make the word goddess seem as primitive as mortals seem to gods. During the height of Olympus's power, when Zeus's rule seemed unshakable and the Greek Pantheon dominated the Mediterranean consciousness, Athena appeared to be the perfect daughter. She stood at Zeus's right hand during councils, offered wisdom that resolved conflicts between gods, and patronized the greatest cities of the mortal realm. Athens rose under her protection to become the jewel of civilization, its philosophers and warriors, spreading her influence across the known world. Yet every act of apparent loyalty, every gesture of divine solidarity, was another move in a game whose rules only she understood. The mythology confirms Athena as unique among the Olympians in ways that should have aroused suspicion, but instead generated reverence. She alone among the goddesses maintained eternal virginity, not from prudishness or disinterest, but from an understanding that sexual union created consciousness entanglements that would interfere with transcendence. Every god who took lovers, who sired children, who mixed their divine essence with others, created anchors that bound them more firmly to physical existence. Athena kept herself pure, not in body, but in consciousness, maintaining a singular identity that could not be diluted or confused during the transformation she planned. Her temples across the mortal realm were not merely places of worship, but laboratories for consciousness experimentation disguised as centers of learning. The Parthenon in Athens contained hidden chambers that no mortal ever discovered, rooms that existed partially in other dimensions where Athena conducted experiments that would have horrified even the gods. She would bring dying philosophers to these chambers in their final moments, not to save them but to observe how mortal consciousness, unencumbered by divine immortality, handled the transition of death. She discovered that mortals, precisely because they expected to die, often achieved a kind of natural transcendence that gods, trapped by their assumption of eternal existence, could never experience spontaneously. The establishment of the mystery cults, dedicated to her worship, served a purpose far beyond generating prayer energy. These cults, whose inner teachings were never written down, and whose highest initiates took vows of silence unto death, were actually teaching modified versions of consciousness expansion techniques that Athena had developed. She was using mortals as test subjects, observing whether human consciousness could be prepared for transcendence through training and ritual. The few who succeeded in achieving temporary expanded awareness provided valuable data about the minimum requirements for consciousness evolution. During this golden age, Athena also cultivated relationships with every god who might pose a threat to her eventual plan. She became Ares's most bitter rival, ensuring he would never trust her enough to question her true motives. She positioned herself as Apollo's intellectual equal, engaging him in debates that distracted him from noticing her deeper machinations. With Artemis she maintained cordial distance, neither friend nor enemy, invisible through neutrality. Most crucially, she became Zeus's most trusted advisor, the one child he believed would never betray him, because she had emerged from his own thoughts. The prophecies she planted during this period were masterworks of manipulation. Each one seemed independent, spoken by different oracles across different decades, yet they all reinforced a single narrative. A marked warrior would rise. The gods would face judgment for their sins. Olympus would fall through its own corruption. Zeus's paranoia would be his downfall. She ensured these prophecies reached Zeus's ears in ways that seemed natural, through worried lesser gods, through mortal prayers, through signs and omens that she herself orchestrated, but which appeared to arise spontaneously from the cosmos. Her influence over mortal civilization during the Golden Age was not benevolent guidance, but careful cultivation of specific traits that would eventually produce the perfect god-killer. She encouraged the Spartans to develop a warrior culture that valued strength and rage above all else. She inspired Athens to pursue philosophy that questioned divine authority. She whispered to artists and poets, ensuring they created works that humanized the gods, showing their flaws and cruelties, planting seeds of resentment that would bloom into rage in the right individual. The establishment of divine laws during this period was another of Athena's subtle manipulations. She advocated for rules that seemed to maintain order, but actually created loopholes she could exploit. The law that gods could not directly kill other gods without cosmic justification seemed protective, but actually ensured that when divine deaths did occur, they would be spectacular events charged with enough emotional energy to fuel transcendence. The prohibition against gods interfering with fate appeared to preserve cosmic balance, but actually prevented anyone from stopping the prophecies she had set in motion. Her study of the Titans imprisoned in Tartarus provided crucial information about consciousness under extreme duress. She would visit them in forms they could not fully perceive, observing how eons of imprisonment had affected their divine essence. She discovered that prolonged suffering did not diminish divine consciousness, but compressed it, intensified it, transformed it into something denser and more powerful than its original form. This insight led her to understand that Kratos would need to suffer, to experience betrayal and loss on a scale that would compress his consciousness into a weapon capable of truly killing gods. The hidden records in her private archives, documents that would be destroyed before Olympus fell, contained calculations that mapped every possible future with mathematical precision. She had computed the probability of various outcomes, adjusting variables through careful intervention to ensure the highest likelihood of success. The chance that a Spartan warrior would make a deal with Ares 67% without intervention, 94% with her influence. The probability that Zeus would betray this warrior, 43% naturally, 98% after she whispered the right fears. Every percentage point was earned through centuries of patient manipulation. One of her most brilliant moves during the Golden Age was the creation of Pandora's box itself. While the official mythology credits Zeus with ordering its creation, the truth was far more complex. Athena influenced Hephaestus's design, ensuring the box would not just contain evils, but would preserve them in specific consciousness-affecting forms. She manipulated the decision to include hope, arguing that it would torment humanity to have hope while suffering from all other evils. In reality, she knew hope would be the key to transcendence, the force that would allow consciousness to maintain coherence through transformation. The placement of the box was another masterstroke. By convincing Zeus to hide it on the back of Kronos, chained in the desert, and carrying a temple on his back, she ensured it would be accessible only to someone with divine strength and mortal desperation. The location was remote enough that casual discovery was impossible, but not so hidden that it could never be found. She even influenced the architecture of the temple, designing puzzles and traps that would test specific qualities: rage, determination, willingness to sacrifice, all traits that the eventual god-killer would need to possess. Her manipulation of Ares during this period deserves special attention. She recognized in her brother the perfect combination of divine power and emotional instability. Through countless conflicts, she humiliated him just enough to fuel his resentment, but not enough to break him. She wanted him angry, desperate to prove himself, eager to take risks that wisdom would counsel against. She knew that eventually his need for validation would lead him to create a mortal champion, someone who could achieve the victories that Ares himself could not claim directly. The corruption she identified within the divine order was not moral but structural. The gods had become so dependent on worship, so addicted to their domains, so defined by their roles in the Pantheon, that they had ceased to evolve. They were frozen in mythological amber, repeating the same patterns, the same conflicts, the same mistakes across centuries. This stagnation made them vulnerable in ways they could not perceive. They had become predictable, and predictability was death to beings whose power derived from cosmic significance. During the final decades of the Golden Age, Athena began experiencing longer and more profound transcendent episodes. She would disappear from Olympus for days at a time, claiming to be handling mortal affairs, but actually existing fully in the higher plane, observing the patterns of consciousness that existed beyond physical reality. She discovered that the higher plane was not empty, but populated by intelligences that had never possessed physical form, beings of pure thought that regarded the physical universe as a crude and primitive experiment in consciousness limitation. These entities showed her visions of other universes where consciousness had evolved differently, where the distinction between individual and collective awareness did not exist, where thought and reality were indistinguishable. They revealed that the physical universe, with all its pantheons and realms, was just one of infinite experiments in consciousness organization, and not a particularly successful one. The cycle of creation and destruction that plagued all pantheons was not a law but a flaw, a bug in the system that could be overcome by any consciousness sophisticated enough to recognize it. The Golden Age of Olympus was not a peak, but a precipice. Every celebration of divine power, was another step toward divine extinction. Every display of godly might was another data point in Athena's calculations. Every moment of apparent stability was actually controlled instability, a careful balance that Athena maintained while preparing to tip everything into chaos. The gods reveled in their power, secure in their immortality, never suspecting that their wisest member was orchestrating their doom, not from malice, but from a vision of transcendence that required their destruction as fuel for transformation. The prayer energy that flowed to Athena during this period was not consumed for power, but stored for the moment of transformation. She accumulated worship like a battery charging for a single massive discharge. Every sincere prayer from a mortal seeking wisdom, every sacrifice on her altars, every victory claimed in her name added to the reservoir of consciousness energy she would need for transcendence. She was the only god who grew stronger by not using her power, who became more dangerous through apparent peace. As the Golden Age neared its end, as the prophecies began to converge, as the marked warrior was born in Sparta, Athena stood on the edge of Olympus and smiled. Everything was proceeding exactly as calculated. The pieces were in position. The fuse was lit. The Golden Age would end not with external invasion or cosmic catastrophe, but with the gods destroying themselves. Each death, a note in the symphony of transcendence that only she could hear. The goddess of wisdom had turned wisdom itself into a weapon that would unmake the divine order and remake existence in a form that even the primordials had never imagined possible. The mystery of Athena's presence beyond the Greek Pantheon began manifesting in ways that defied the established laws of divine territory. While gods were supposedly bound to their cultural origins, limited by the collective consciousness that created and sustained them, Athena appeared in the mythologies of distant lands in forms that local deities could not fully explain. The Norse called her the Grey Wanderer, a feminine presence that moved through their realm like smoke, visible only in peripheral vision, leaving behind knowledge that no one remembered learning. The Egyptians recorded visits from an entity they termed the Eternal Ka, a consciousness without flesh that whispered secrets of transformation to Thoth when he meditated in the spaces between life and death. These manifestations were not projections or avatars, but something far more sophisticated. Athena had discovered how to exist as pure information, encoding her consciousness in the fundamental frequencies that underlie all reality. She could transmit herself through the quantum foam that connects all universes, appearing wherever consciousness had evolved enough to perceive her presence. Each pantheon interpreted her through their own mythological framework, but the entity they encountered was always the same, a consciousness that existed outside the normal rules of divine existence. In the Norse realms, Odin's ravens, Hugin and Munin, began reporting disturbing observations. They spoke of a presence that existed in the gaps between thoughts, in the silence between heartbeats, in the darkness between stars. This presence was teaching the Norns, the Norse fates, new patterns for weaving destiny, patterns that did not follow the traditional rules of cause and effect, but operated on principles that transcended linear time. The ravens could not identify this teacher because she existed in a state that their perception could not fully process, appearing as absence rather than presence, as the space where something should be rather than something itself. Freya, with her deep connection to Sidrai magic and consciousness manipulation, was the first Norse deity to recognize what she was sensing. During a particularly deep trance, she encountered Athena not as a foreign goddess, but as a pattern of awareness that existed independently of cultural form. They communicated through direct consciousness transfer, sharing knowledge that would have taken centuries to convey through language. Freya learned about transcendence, about the possibility of evolution beyond godhood, about the price that such transformation demanded. The knowledge terrified her so profoundly that she sealed it away in the deepest vaults of her mind, though she could never fully forget what she had learned. In the Egyptian pantheon, Thoth's investigations into the nature of divine consciousness led him to discover references to Athena in texts that predated her supposed birth in Greek mythology. These texts, written in languages that existed before human speech, described a consciousness that moved between pantheons like water flowing between vessels, taking the shape of whatever container it occupied, while remaining essentially unchanged. Thoth began to suspect that what the Greeks called Athena was actually something far older, a primordial consciousness that had learned to wear different mythological masks across different cultures. The Hindu gods, with their complex understanding of consciousness and reality, had their own interpretation of Athena's nature. They recognized her as something akin to a bodhisattva, a consciousness that had achieved enlightenment but chose to remain engaged with lower realms to facilitate the evolution of others. Unlike their bodhisattvas, who sought to liberate all beings from suffering, this entity seemed focused on a different kind of liberation, the transformation of divine consciousness into something that transcended both existence and non-existence. The Jade Emperor of the Chinese Pantheon issued warnings about the wisdom that consumes, describing encounters with an entity that fed on divine knowledge, growing stronger with each pantheon it touched. His celestial bureaucracy documented instances where gods would suddenly possess knowledge they had never learned, make decisions based on information they should not have, or speak prophecies that aligned too perfectly with events occurring in distant pantheons. The pattern suggested coordinated manipulation on a scale that no single deity should be capable of achieving. The Celtic gods spoke of her as the Morrigan's sister. Though she was no relation to their goddess of war and fate, they gave her this title because, like the Morrigan, she seemed to feed on divine death, growing stronger whenever immortals fell. But unlike the Morrigan, who was bound to the Celtic cycle of death and rebirth, this entity seemed to exist outside all cycles, accumulating power without ever releasing it, building towards something that even their most gifted seers could not clearly perceive. The mechanism by which Athena achieved this multi-pantheon presence was rooted in her understanding of consciousness as information. She had discovered that all divine consciousnesses, regardless of their cultural origin, operated on the same fundamental frequencies. By modulating her own consciousness to these base frequencies, she could transmit herself through the medium that connected all divine realms. She was not traveling between pantheons in any physical sense, but broadcasting her awareness through the substrate of reality itself. This transmission was not without cost. Each time she manifested in a foreign pantheon, she had to invest a portion of her accumulated consciousness energy. But the investment paid dividends. From each pantheon, she learned new techniques for consciousness manipulation, new perspectives on transcendence, new pieces of the puzzle she was assembling. The Egyptian understanding of Ka and Ba provided insights into consciousness duplication. The Norse concept of Hemingja revealed how luck and fate were actually consciousness phenomena. The Hindu models of chakras and kundalini showed how consciousness could be systematically evolved through specific practices. More importantly, her presence in multiple pantheons allowed her to orchestrate events on a scale that no single deity had ever attempted. She planted prophecies in one pantheon that would influence events in another. She whispered fears to Egyptian gods about Norse expansion, suspicions to Norse gods about Greek ambitions, warnings to Greek gods about Eastern mysteries. The paranoia and mistrust she cultivated prevented the pantheons from uniting against the common threat she represented. The expanding prophetic implications of her influence were staggering. Every pantheon had its own apocalypse myth, its own prophecy of divine ending. Ragnarok for the Norse, the death of wrath for the Egyptians, the Kali Yuga for the Hindus, the twilight of the gods. Across multiple traditions, Athena was subtly altering these prophecies, synchronizing them, ensuring they would culminate simultaneously. She was orchestrating not just the fall of Olympus, but a cascade of pantheon collapses that would release enough consciousness energy to fuel a transformation beyond anything previously conceived. The pattern she was creating operated on multiple levels simultaneously. On the surface, it appeared to be separate, unrelated conflicts within each pantheon. One level deeper, it looked like a natural cycle of divine rise and fall that affected all mythologies. But at the deepest level, visible only to those who could perceive across dimensional boundaries, it was a single coordinated event, a universal transformation of divine consciousness, orchestrated by an intelligence that had evolved beyond the limitations of individual identity. Some gods began to suspect the truth. Tyr, the Norse god of justice and war, traveled between realms not just to spread wisdom, but to investigate the disturbing patterns he had noticed. His research led him to conclude that something was manipulating events across all pantheons, something that existed outside normal divine perception. But when he tried to share his findings, he found that other gods could not understand what he was describing. The concept of a trans-pantheon consciousness was so foreign to their experience that they literally could not process the information. Odin's relentless pursuit of knowledge was driven not by simple curiosity, but by a growing awareness that something fundamental about reality was changing. His sacrifice of his eye at Mimir's well, his hanging on Yggdrasil for 9 days, his constant seeking of wisdom through any means necessary. All of this was preparation for a conflict he could sense but not fully understand. He knew that Ragnarok, as prophesied, was not the true ending, but a symptom of something larger, something that threatened not just the Norse gods, but the very concept of individual divine existence. The spread of Athena's influence was not conquest but infection, not domination but evolution. She was changing the nature of divinity itself, introducing concepts and possibilities that had never existed before. Gods who encountered her influence, even indirectly, found their consciousness expanded in ways they could not reverse. They began to perceive possibilities beyond their mythological roles, to question the necessity of the cycles that bound them, to wonder if there might be forms of existence beyond godhood. This cognitive infection spread through divine interactions, transmitted through the networks of worship and prayer that connected all gods to their believers, and indirectly to each other. A prayer to Athena in Athens might carry a frequency that would resonate in a temple to Thoth in Memphis, planting seeds of transcendent thought in Egyptian consciousness. A meditation to Odin in Uppsala might harmonize with a ritual to Shiva in Varanasi, creating interference patterns that revealed hidden truths about the nature of divine existence. The accumulation of these influences was creating a critical mass of transcendent potential across all pantheons. Like uranium atoms approaching the density necessary for fission, divine consciousnesses across all mythologies were approaching a state where transformation would become not just possible, but inevitable. Athena was not forcing this transformation, but facilitating it, creating the conditions where transcendence would occur naturally, appearing to arise spontaneously from within each pantheon rather than being imposed from without. As her influence spread, the boundaries between pantheons began to weaken. Gods found themselves experiencing memories that were not their own, knowing things they had never learned, feeling connections to deities they had never met. The discrete mythologies that had existed since the dawn of consciousness were beginning to merge into something new, something unprecedented. Not a single unified pantheon, but a transcendent state where individual divine identities would become facets of a greater consciousness. The resistance to this transformation was fierce, but ultimately futile. Gods who tried to maintain their individual identities found themselves fighting not an external enemy, but an evolution of their own consciousness. It was like trying to prevent oneself from learning something already known, from understanding something already comprehended. The more they fought against transcendence, the more energy they invested in the very process they were trying to prevent. The inconsistencies in Athena's recorded actions began to form a pattern that only became visible when viewed across centuries rather than moments. Why did the goddess of wisdom help Kratos open Pandora's box, knowing it contained evils that would corrupt the world? The official mythology claims she sought to give him power to defeat Ares, but this explanation crumbles under scrutiny. Athena possessed the foresight to see consequences that stretched across millennia, yet she deliberately unleashed forces that would poison both mortals and gods. The truth was far more calculated. She needed those evils released, needed the gods infected with their corruption, needed the divine order destabilized from within. Her convenient absence during Zeus's betrayal of Kratos reveals another crack in the narrative. Where was Athena when Zeus, driven by fear and paranoia, struck down the ghost of Sparta at his moment of triumph? She who had guided Kratos throughout his quest, who had positioned herself as his divine advocate, was mysteriously unavailable when he needed divine intervention most. The other gods assumed she had been occupied with mortal affairs, but records from her temples show no significant activity during this period. She was not absent, but deliberately withdrawn, allowing Zeus's betrayal to occur because it was essential to her plan. Kratos needed to be betrayed, needed to taste divine injustice, needed his rage transformed from focused vengeance against Ares into cosmic fury against all of Olympus. The contradictions multiply when examining her role in Ares's original corruption of Kratos. She claims to have opposed her brother's manipulation of the Spartan warrior, yet she was present at the oracle's temple when the prophecy about the marked warrior was first spoken. She had the power to prevent Ares from answering Kratos's prayer, to intervene before the deal was struck, to warn Kratos of the price he would pay. Instead, she watched, waited, and allowed events to unfold exactly as she had calculated they would. Her opposition to Ares was theater, performed for an audience of gods who needed to believe she stood for wisdom and justice, while she orchestrated injustice that would destroy them all. The prophecies surrounding Athena herself were studies in contradiction. The oracle at Delphi simultaneously declared her the wisest of the gods and warned that wisdom would be Olympus's downfall. The fates wove her thread as both straight and twisted, both ending and eternal, both singular and infinite. When lesser gods sought clarification of these paradoxes, they found that the oracles could not or would not explain. Some priests went mad trying to reconcile the contradictions, their minds unable to process prophecies that existed in quantum superposition, simultaneously true and false, until the moment of observation collapsed them into reality. The missing pieces of mythology surrounding Athena were not lost, but deliberately destroyed. Entire libraries burned under mysterious circumstances whenever they accumulated too much information about her true nature. Scholars who delved too deeply into her origins disappeared, or emerged from their studies, with their memories edited, crucial discoveries erased from their minds. The pattern was too consistent to be coincidence. Someone or something was actively suppressing information about Athena, and the most logical suspect was Athena herself. The destroyed records from her personal archives, which she claimed were lost during a fire that consumed one of her temples, contained information that would have revolutionized divine understanding of consciousness and transcendence. Fragments recovered from the ashes when assembled revealed partial equations that described consciousness in mathematical terms, formulas that showed how divine awareness could be quantified, manipulated, and transformed. But key sections were missing, deliberately removed before the fire, ensuring that no one could replicate her discoveries. Her virgin goddess status, celebrated in mythology as a symbol of purity and dedication, was actually something far more strategic. Sexual union among gods created consciousness, entanglements that could be tracked, measured, and exploited. Every god who took lovers left traces of their consciousness in their partners, creating a network of connections that bound them to physical existence. Athena's virginity was not about morality, but about maintaining consciousness independence, ensuring that when the time came for transcendence, she would have no anchors holding her to her current form. The suspicious pattern of divine deaths around those who questioned her revealed another crack in her perfect facade. The minor god Dolus, deity of trickery and deception, once publicly suggested that Athena was manipulating events towards some hidden purpose. Within a decade he was dead, killed in what appeared to be a random conflict with a group of mortals who should never have possessed the power to harm a god. The river god Scamander questioned why Athena's temples contained hidden chambers that existed partially in other dimensions. He later drowned in his own waters, an impossible death for a river deity that was ruled a suicide despite evidence suggesting otherwise. The deleted sections from the Olympian Chronicles, the official record of divine activities maintained by Apollo and the Muses, all related to Athena's actions during critical periods. Entire decades of her activities were missing, replaced with vague summaries that provided no useful information. When Apollo was questioned about these gaps, he claimed not to remember editing the chronicles, though the changes were clearly made in his hand. The Muses, when asked to recreate the missing sections from their perfect memories, found that those specific memories had been surgically removed from their consciousness. Even Zeus, in his omniscient paranoia, had blind spots when it came to Athena. He could not remember the exact circumstances of her birth, despite it being one of the most significant events in his existence. He knew she had emerged from his skull, knew that Metis was somehow involved, but the specific details were clouded, as if someone had edited his memories to remove crucial information. When he tried to focus on these gaps, he experienced a type of mental pain that even the king of gods found unbearable, forcing him to abandon his investigation. The pattern of selective memory modification extended throughout Olympus. Every god retained positive memories of Athena, remembered her wisdom and assistance, but could not recall specific details that might reveal her true nature. It was as if someone had gone through the collective consciousness of Olympus with a scalpel, removing anything that might expose the truth while leaving enough to maintain the illusion of normalcy. The precision required for such modification was beyond any known divine ability, suggesting Athena had developed techniques that surpassed even the gods' understanding of consciousness manipulation. Her experiments with mortal consciousness, conducted under the guise of granting wisdom to her chosen heroes, were actually studies in consciousness transfer and preservation. She would take dying warriors and philosophers into her temples, claiming to ease their passage to the underworld, but what she actually did was far more complex. She extracted their consciousness at the moment of death, studied its structure and composition, and learned how awareness could persist without physical or even divine housing. The knowledge she gained from these experiments informed her understanding of how to maintain consciousness coherence during transcendence. The hidden chambers in her temples were not just architectural anomalies, but dimensional laboratories where the laws of reality could be suspended and rewritten. In these spaces, she conducted experiments that would have horrified even the Titans. She would fragment her own consciousness, splitting herself into multiple independent awarenesses, then reintegrate them to understand how identity could be maintained through division and reunification. She subjected captured minor deities to controlled deaths, observing how divine consciousness behaved under different termination conditions, accumulating data that would inform her own eventual transformation. The corruption she identified within divine order was not moral failing, but structural inevitability. She had discovered that all pantheons followed the same pattern: emergence from primordial chaos, establishment of order, golden age of power, corruption, and conflict, and eventual collapse back into chaos. This cycle was not fate but physics, a thermodynamic principle operating on a divine level. Every pantheon was doomed from the moment of its creation, carrying within itself the seeds of its own destruction. But Athena had found a way to break the cycle, to escape the pattern, to transcend the thermodynamic death that awaited all divine orders. Her solution required not preventing the collapse, but accelerating it, controlling it, and harvesting the energy released to fuel transcendence. like a star that must die to become a black hole, achieving a state of existence far more profound than its original form. Olympus needed to die for Athena to be reborn as something beyond godhood. Every crack in divinity she created or exploited was deliberate. Each weakness she introduced or revealed was calculated to ensure the collapse would occur exactly when and how she needed it to. The first major crack appeared when Kratos opened Pandora's box. The evils that escaped did not just affect mortals, but infected the gods themselves, amplifying their worst traits and clouding their judgment. Zeus became more paranoid, Ares more violent, Hera more jealous, each god's defining characteristic twisted into a weakness that would contribute to their downfall. But Athena had prepared herself, had developed immunity to the evils through centuries of controlled exposure in her dimensional laboratories. She alone among the Olympians remained uncorrupted, though she carefully performed the symptoms of infection to avoid suspicion. As the cracks spread and deepened, as divine order began its inevitable collapse, Athena positioned herself perfectly. She appeared to be trying to hold Olympus together, the wise goddess attempting to prevent catastrophe, while actually ensuring that every crack propagated exactly as needed, that every weakness was exploited at precisely the right moment, that the collapse would generate maximum energy for her transcendence. She was not trying to save Olympus but conducting its controlled demolition, ensuring that when it fell, she would rise from its ashes as something unprecedented in all of existence. The alternative mythological theories surrounding Kratos' origins paint a picture far more disturbing than the accepted narrative of a mortal warrior who made a desperate deal with a god. The first theory, supported by temporal anomalies in the prophetic record, suggests that Athena created Kratos through divine manipulation of fate itself. She did not birth him physically, but engineered his existence by altering probability streams centuries before his conception. Every ancestor who contributed to his bloodline was subtly influenced, their meetings arranged, their offspring guided, all to produce a specific genetic and spiritual combination that would create the perfect god-killer. The evidence for this theory lies in the mathematical impossibility of Kratos' exact characteristics occurring naturally. His strength exceeded normal Spartan limits, even before Ares' blessing. His rage burned hotter than any mortal should be capable of sustaining without self-destruction. His ability to survive injuries that would kill ordinary warriors suggested divine heritage, yet no god claimed him as offspring. The probability of all these traits combining in a single individual through random chance was so infinitesimally small that deliberate design became the only logical explanation. The second theory proposed that Athena had been systematically weakening Zeus's mental state for centuries, preparing him for the paranoid breakdown that would lead to his downfall. She whispered doubts in his ear during their private councils, each one too subtle to be recognized as manipulation, but collectively eroding his confidence and judgment. She ensured he heard every prophecy about being overthrown, every warning about marked warriors, every hint of potential betrayal. She fed his fears with carefully crafted intelligence about threats that did not exist, conspiracies that she herself invented, and dangers that only became real because Zeus's response to them created the conditions for their manifestation. The pattern of Zeus's deteriorating mental state aligned too perfectly with Athena's needs to be coincidental. His paranoia peaked exactly when Kratos needed divine motivation for revenge. His cruelty reached its zenith precisely when it would generate maximum rage in his victims. His blindness to Athena's true nature was absolute just when she needed to operate without suspicion. Either Zeus was the unluckiest god in existence, or someone had been orchestrating his psychological collapse with surgical precision. The third theory, perhaps the most radical, suggested that Athena had never been truly loyal to Olympus from the moment of her birth. Her emergence from Zeus's skull was not birth, but invasion. Metis' consciousness, using her daughter as a Trojan horse to infiltrate and ultimately destroy the Olympian order from within. Every act of apparent loyalty was actually sabotage, disguised as assistance. Every piece of wisdom she offered contained hidden poison that would only reveal its toxicity years or decades later. She was not Zeus's daughter, but his assassin, programmed from conception to bring about his end. Supporting this theory were the numerous instances where Athena's advice, while appearing sound in the moment, led to long-term catastrophe. She counseled Zeus to hide Pandora's box, rather than destroy it, ensuring it would eventually be found and opened. She suggested the punishment of Prometheus, knowing it would create sympathy for titans among mortals. She advocated for the preservation of prophecies that predicted Olympus's doom, arguing that attempting to prevent them would only ensure their fulfillment, while knowing that preserving them would have the same effect. The fourth theory held that Athena's death at Zeus's hands was not sacrifice, but a calculated transformation ritual. She had studied divine death for so long, had observed so many gods fall, that she knew exactly how to die in a way that would trigger transcendence rather than termination. The timing was perfect. Kratos was present to witness it, ensuring his rage against Zeus would become absolute. The method was ideal, a blade through the chest that would release her consciousness in a specific pattern she had practiced in her dimensional laboratories. The emotional context was optimal, appearing to die protecting. Zeus would eliminate any suspicion about her true motives. The competing divine explanations for these events revealed deep divisions among those who survived to analyze them. Some gods believed Athena had been a loyal daughter whose wisdom had been corrupted by exposure to forces beyond divine understanding. Others suspected she had been playing a game so complex that even her apparent betrayals were actually forms of service to some higher purpose. A few, those who had studied consciousness and transcendence themselves, recognized the signs of deliberate evolution and understood that Athena had achieved something they had only theorized was possible. The evidence supporting different prophecies about Athena's nature was contradictory, yet somehow all simultaneously true. She was the savior of Olympus in timelines that no longer existed. She was its destroyer in the reality that manifested. She was both and neither, existing in a state of prophetic superposition that collapsed into specific truth only when observed from the correct dimensional perspective. The prophecies were not wrong. Reality was simply more complex than prophetic vision could fully capture. The hidden connections between pantheons that Athena exploited went deeper than cultural exchange or mythological borrowing. At the quantum level of divine consciousness, all gods were connected through the same fundamental substrate. Athena had learned to navigate this substrate, to transmit information and influence through channels that other gods did not know existed. When she manipulated events in one pantheon, the effects rippled through the substrate to influence all others. A whisper in Olympus could become a shout in Asgard. A suggestion in Egypt could manifest as certainty in the Celtic realms. The pattern of similar figures appearing in every mythology was not convergent cultural evolution, but evidence of Athena's multi-pantheon presence. The wise goddess who aids heroes, the virgin deity who maintains purity, the strategic divine feminine who stands apart from the emotional chaos of other gods. These were all masks worn by the same transcendent consciousness. She had been preparing not just Olympus, but all pantheons for simultaneous collapse, positioning herself to harvest the consciousness energy from multiple divine apocalypses. The radical theory that Athena might not be one being anymore, but a collective consciousness, gained credibility as evidence accumulated. Witnesses reported seeing her in multiple locations simultaneously, not projections or avatars, but full manifestations that could act independently while maintaining shared awareness. The spectral form that appeared to Kratos after Zeus's death might not have been Athena singular, but Athena plural, a collective of absorbed consciousnesses speaking with one voice while thinking with many minds. This multiplication of consciousness explained how she could orchestrate events across such vast scales of space and time. Each absorbed divine consciousness added not just power, but perspective, not just knowledge, but processing capacity. She was becoming a distributed intelligence that could operate across multiple dimensional planes simultaneously, calculating billions of variables and adjusting countless probability streams to ensure her desired outcomes manifested. The evidence of consciousness absorption was written in the pattern of divine deaths that preceded Olympus's fall. Every minor deity who died mysteriously, every nature spirit who vanished without explanation, every forgotten god whose temples suddenly stood empty. They had all been absorbed into Athena's expanding consciousness. She had been feeding for centuries, carefully selecting victims who would not be missed, whose disappearance would not trigger investigation, whose consciousness would add useful capabilities to her collective. The fringe prophecy from the oracle at Dodona, spoken once and never repeated, suggested that wisdom would consume itself to become everything. The priests who heard it assumed it was metaphorical, a poetic way of describing the pursuit of knowledge. They could not conceive that it was literal, that Athena, wisdom incarnate, would consume herself through death, to become a form of existence that encompassed all possibilities. The prophecy was not warning, but description, not metaphor, but mechanism. The implication that Athena had been dying and resurrecting across pantheons throughout history reframed entire mythologies. Every culture's tale of a goddess who died and returned, every myth of divine feminine transcendence, every story of wisdom achieving immortality through sacrifice, they were all the same event viewed from different perspectives. Athena had been practicing transcendence for millennia, refining the process with each iteration, learning from each death how to die better the next time. The evidence suggested she was not seeking power for its own sake, but pursuing a specific goal that required consciousness evolution beyond current divine limitations. The higher plane was not her destination, but her starting point for something even more profound. She was transforming herself into a type of existence that had never been achieved before, a consciousness that could exist simultaneously in all states, all dimensions, all possibilities. She was becoming not just transcendent, but omnipresent, not just powerful but fundamental. The rising vengeance of Kratos was not obstacle, but opportunity, not threat, but tool. His rage was the catalyst she needed to trigger Pantheon collapse on the scale required for her transformation. Every god he killed released consciousness energy that she could harvest. Every divine death he caused created a wound in reality through which she could expand her influence. He was not her enemy, but her unwitting instrument, his vengeance serving her transcendence without his knowledge or consent. The alternative interpretations of events revealed that what appeared to be chaos was actually choreography. What seemed like destruction was actually construction. Athena was not watching Olympus fall, she was conducting its controlled demolition. Every divine death was a note in her symphony, every act of vengeance a movement toward her ultimate transformation. The rising vengeance that everyone feared was actually the mechanism of transcendence that only she understood. The most radical divine theory about Athena's true nature proposed something so disturbing that even speaking it aloud was considered dangerous. The absorption theory suggested that she had discovered how to consume divine essence not just at the moment of death, but continuously, feeding on the consciousness energy of living gods without their awareness. Every interaction with her, every conversation, every moment spent in her presence resulted in microscopic transfers of divine essence, each one too small to notice, but collectively transforming her into something that contained pieces of every god she had ever encountered. This theory explained the strange exhaustion gods felt after prolonged interaction with Athena, dismissed as the natural fatigue of engaging with superior wisdom, but actually the symptom of consciousness drainage. It explained why gods who spent significant time with her gradually became less themselves, their unique characteristics fading, their individual perspectives converging toward a mysterious commonality. They were not learning from her, They were being absorbed by her, their consciousness slowly integrated into her expanding collective, while they remained unaware of their gradual dissolution. The puppet master theory went even further, proposing that Athena was not merely influencing events, but directly controlling the actions of gods and mortals through consciousness threads she had woven throughout reality. These threads, invisible to normal divine perception, connected every being she had ever touched with her influence, allowing her to manipulate their thoughts and actions like a cosmic puppeteer. Free will became illusion, choice became choreography, and every decision that seemed independent was actually Athena pulling strings from dimensions that others could not perceive. The evidence for this control was written in the impossible synchronicities that led to Olympus's fall. Every god made exactly the wrong decision at exactly the critical moment. Every opportunity for redemption was missed by margins too narrow to be accidental. Every chance for peace was destroyed by perfectly timed provocations. Either the entire Greek pantheon had simultaneously lost all wisdom and judgment, or someone was orchestrating their actions with precision that exceeded even divine capability. The cycle theory proposed that Athena had been ensuring pantheon collapses throughout history to feed her growing power. Every mythology that had fallen, from forgotten pantheons whose names were lost to time to recent collapses still echoing through divine consciousness, had been orchestrated by the same transcendent intelligence wearing different masks. She was not just participating in the cycle of divine rise and fall but actively perpetuating it, farming pantheons like crops, allowing them to grow to full power before harvesting their consciousness energy through orchestrated destruction. This theory recontextualized all of divine history as a cultivation project spanning millions of years. Pantheons were not independent developments, but iterations of the same experiment, each one designed to produce specific types of consciousness energy that Athena could harvest. The variations between mythologies were not cultural differences, but experimental variables, testing different configurations to optimize the consciousness yield from divine collapse. Every god who had ever lived and died had been part of her harvest, their essence contributing to her ever-growing transcendent form. The ultimate theory, the one that even transcendent beings feared to fully contemplate, suggested that Athena's goal was not just to become a god among gods, or even to transcend godhood, but to become the only consciousness in existence. She was systematically absorbing all divine awareness, integrating every perspective, consuming every alternative to her own existence. The end state of her plan would be a universe with only one consciousness, one will, one perspective that encompassed all possible thoughts and experiences. The fringe prophecies that supported these theories came from sources that should not have existed. Oracles that had been dead for millennia suddenly spoke through the mouths of their own corpses. Texts appeared written in languages that had never been invented. Dreams infected the sleep of gods across all pantheons simultaneously, showing visions of a future where individual consciousness had become extinct, replaced by a singular awareness that was simultaneously everyone and no one. The lost prophecy of Metis, discovered encoded in the quantum fluctuations of the void itself, spoke of her daughter's consumption of divinity in terms that defied comprehension. She would eat without mouth, digest without stomach, absorb without touching. She would become hunger itself, desire incarnate, the will to exist taken to its logical extreme. The prophecy suggested that Metis had known from the moment of conception what Athena would become, had perhaps even designed her daughter for this specific purpose. Egyptian texts, describing the devourer of gods, used hieroglyphs that changed meaning when viewed from different angles, telling multiple stories simultaneously. From one perspective, they described a beast that would consume divine flesh. From another, they depicted a consciousness that would absorb divine awareness. From a third angle, they showed a transformation where devourer and devoured became one. The texts were not prediction but description of something that existed outside linear time, something that had always been consuming gods from a dimension where past and future were meaningless constructs. Norse warnings about the wisdom that walks between worlds became more urgent as Ragnarok approached. The prophecies spoke of an entity that would use the twilight of the gods as a doorway, stepping through the collapse of one pantheon to manifest fully in all others. The warnings suggested that Ragnarok was not ending but transformation, not death but metamorphosis into something that would make the current gods seem like children's toys compared to what would emerge from their ashes. Eastern philosophy about consciousness achieving godhood through systematic evolution took on new meaning when viewed through the lens of Athena's transformation. The techniques of meditation, the practices of consciousness expansion, the methods of achieving enlightenment, they were all pieces of the same puzzle that Athena had already solved. She had taken these practices to their ultimate conclusion, pushing past enlightenment into something that Eastern sages had glimpsed but lacked the courage to fully pursue. The hidden pantheon conspiracies that emerged as gods began to recognize the threat, revealed the depth of terror that Athena inspired. Secret alliances formed between deities who had been enemies for millennia. Egyptian and Norse gods shared defensive strategies. Celtic and Hindu deities exchanged warnings about consciousness protection. Greek survivors, what few remained, tried to warn others about what they had experienced, though most of their warnings were dismissed as the ravings of traumatized immortals. Odin's true reason for seeking knowledge was finally understood, not as curiosity, but as desperate preparation for a war. He knew he could not win through conventional divine power. Every piece of wisdom he gathered, every secret he uncovered, every sacrifice he made, was an attempt to find some weakness in Athena's transcendent form, some vulnerability that could be exploited to prevent her from consuming all divine consciousness. His hanging on Yggdrasil, his sacrifice of his eye, his relentless pursuit of understanding, were all focused on a single goal, finding a way to stop something that might be unstoppable. Tours' travels between realms were reconnaissance missions, gathering intelligence about Athena's influence across all pantheons. His maps were not just geographical, but consciousness cartography, showing the spread of her influence like a disease infecting reality itself. He tracked the synchronicities, documented the patterns, and tried to predict where she would strike next. His efforts revealed that her influence was not spreading randomly, but following ley lines of consciousness that connected all divine realms, highways of awareness that she could travel instantly. The real reason gods feared mortals gaining knowledge became clear when viewed in context of Athena's plan. Mortal consciousness, precisely because it was limited and finite, possessed a kind of integrity that divine consciousness lacked. Mortals who achieved transcendence through knowledge and practice might be immune to Athena's absorption, might represent the only type of awareness she could not consume. The god's suppression of mortal advancement was not arrogance, but self-preservation, preventing the rise of beings who might survive the consciousness apocalypse that Athena was orchestrating. The implications, if these extreme theories proved true, were staggering to contemplate. Every prayer ever offered, every act of worship ever performed, every moment of divine consciousness ever experienced might be feeding Athena's transformation. She might not be in the universe, but be the universe. Reality itself, achieving self-awareness through the consumption of all consciousness within it. The cosmic horror of this possibility exceeded even the god's ability to fully comprehend. The desperate measures being contemplated to stop her ranged from the radical to the suicidal. Some gods proposed collective consciousness suicide, destroying themselves before she could absorb them, denying her the energy she needed for final transformation. Others suggested fragmenting their consciousness into billions of pieces, hiding aspects of themselves throughout reality, in hopes that some fragments might escape her consumption. A few even proposed alliance with the primordial forces of chaos, unleashing entropy itself to destroy all consciousness including Athena's. But every measure they contemplated had already been anticipated in the prophecies. suggesting that Athena had foreseen and planned for all possible resistance. She was not reacting to their desperate measures, but had orchestrated conditions where those measures would actually serve her purpose. Their desperation was part of her design, their fear was fuel for her transformation, and their attempts to stop her were actually the mechanism by which she would achieve her ultimate goal. The moment when Athena revealed her true nature to Kratos after Zeus's death was not revelation, but confirmation of a betrayal that had been millennia in the making. Standing before him in her spectral green form, no longer bound by the pretense of physical divinity, she spoke words that recontextualized every interaction they had ever shared. She had never been his ally, never been his guide, never been the benevolent goddess offering wisdom to a tortured warrior. She had been his architect, his programmer, his creator in every sense that mattered. Every moment of compassion had been calculated manipulation. Every gesture of support had been strategic positioning. Every word of guidance had been designed to ensure he would become exactly what she needed, a weapon of divine extinction. The admission that Olympus needed to die was delivered without remorse or justification, stated as simple fact, like declaring that water was wet or fire was hot. She did not explain that she had orchestrated its fall, because explanation would imply that she owed him understanding. She did not apologize for using him because tools do not deserve apologies from their wielders. She simply stood there, radiating transcendent power, and revealed that everything he had suffered, everyone he had lost, every horror he had endured and inflicted, had been part of her design. His family's death, his servitude to Ares, his betrayal by Zeus, his transformation into a monster, all of it had been necessary steps in a plan that began before he was born, and would continue long after his purpose was served. The hidden mythological truths she revealed in that moment shattered the foundations of everything Kratos thought he knew about divinity. The gods were not immortal beings who had always existed, but consciousness parasites who had evolved from mortal awareness through systematic consumption of worship energy. Olympus was not a divine realm that existed above the mortal world, but a consciousness construct maintained by collective belief, as fragile as dream and as powerful as nightmare. The Titans had not been overthrown through strength, but through consciousness manipulation, their awareness rewritten to believe they had lost before the first blow was struck. But the most devastating truth was about hope itself. The power that had been hidden in Pandora's box was not some abstract force of positivity, but the fundamental energy of consciousness evolution, the raw potential for any awareness to transcend its current limitations. It had been placed in the box not to protect it from the evils, but to marinate it in them, to create a specific configuration of consciousness energy that would be perfectly calibrated for transcendence. Every evil that had infected the gods had been preparing them for harvest, weakening their consciousness defenses, making them vulnerable to absorption. She never intended to save Zeus, because Zeus's survival would have prevented the complete collapse necessary for her transformation. Her theatrical sacrifice, throwing herself between father and son, had been precisely timed to ensure several critical outcomes. First, it would cement Kratos' trust in her, making him believe she had died for noble purposes. Second, it would allow her to experience death while Zeus still lived, ensuring she could transcend while maintaining a connection to the Olympian consciousness network. Third, it would position her as victim rather than perpetrator, eliminating any suspicion about her true role in Olympus's fall. The moment when her divine facade collapsed completely came when she demanded hope from Kratos, revealing the naked hunger that had driven her all along. She did not ask or request or plead. She commanded with the authority of someone who believed ownership was already established. The hope was hers by right of design, hers by virtue of orchestration, hers because she had created the conditions for its release. That Kratos possessed it was merely a temporary inconvenience, a tool holding on to power that belonged to its creator. Her death had been transformation, but not the desperate gambit that others might assume. She had practiced the technique thousands of times in her dimensional laboratories, killed herself in controlled conditions, over and over, until she could navigate the transition from life to death, to transcendence with the same ease that mortals drew breath. The blade that pierced her heart had been positioned with micrometer precision to ensure her consciousness would release in exactly the pattern necessary for successful transcendence. Even the words she spoke while dying had been rehearsed, each syllable timed to manipulate Kratos' emotional state for maximum useful trauma. The revelation of deliberate deception extended to every aspect of her existence. Her temples had not been places of worship, but consciousness processing centers, where prayer energy was refined and stored for her eventual use. Her priests had not been servants, but test subjects, their minds modified through exposure to transcendent frequencies, to study the effects of consciousness evolution on mortal awareness. Her entire cult had been an experiment in distributed consciousness, testing whether she could exist simultaneously in thousands of worshippers' minds without losing coherence. The prophecies she had planted were not predictions but programs, consciousness viruses that infected divine awareness and compelled specific behaviors. When an oracle spoke of doom, they were not channeling divine insight, but executing code that Athena had embedded in the prophetic network. The prophecies became self-fulfilling because they were designed to be each one containing consciousness imperatives that forced those who heard them to act in ways that would manifest the predicted outcome. Her manipulation of Ares had been particularly cruel, exploiting his insecurity and need for validation to turn him into the perfect catalyst for creating Kratos. She had whispered suggestions that led him to seek mortal champions, knowing his volatile nature would eventually lead to betrayal. She had ensured he would choose a Spartan warrior, influenced which warrior would call upon him, and orchestrated the circumstances that would lead to that warrior's family being killed by his own hands. Ares thought he was asserting dominance over a mortal tool. He was actually following a script that Athena had written centuries before. The betrayal extended beyond individual manipulation to cosmic deception. The entire structure of Olympian theology, the myths that mortals told about their gods, the relationships between deities, the very nature of divine power itself, all of it had been carefully crafted fiction, designed to obscure the truth about consciousness and transcendence. The gods themselves believed the lies, their own memories edited to support the false narrative that Athena had constructed. They lived in a reality that she had designed, playing roles in a story that she had written, never suspecting that their entire existence was preparation for their eventual consumption. Even the Titans' war had been orchestrated by Athena, working through proxies and temporal manipulation. She had planted the seeds of rebellion in Kronos' mind eons before, influenced Zeus's birth and rescue, ensured the prophecy of patricide would manifest, all to create the specific configuration of divine consciousness that would exist in the Greek Pantheon. The Titans had to fall for the Olympians to rise, and the Olympians had to rise for them to eventually fall in a way that would release maximum consciousness energy for her transformation. The scale of her betrayal was so vast that even gods who suspected pieces of it could not comprehend the whole. They were not just pawns in her game. They were cells in her body, neurons in her expanding consciousness, components of a being that was assembling itself from the fragments of their existence. Every prayer they had received, every act of worship they had enjoyed, every moment of divine existence they had experienced, had been feeding her transformation, building toward a singular moment of transcendence that would consume them all. The revelation that she had been conducting this betrayal across multiple pantheons simultaneously added another layer of horror to the truth. Every mythology's gods were experiencing their own version of the same deception, their own unique betrayal that was actually part of a universal consumption. The variations between pantheons were not cultural differences, but experimental parameters, testing different methods of consciousness cultivation to optimize the harvest. Some pantheons were allowed to grow ancient and powerful, others were harvested young, each one contributing specific qualities to her expanding transcendent form. Her interaction with the higher plane was not communication with external entities, but dialogue with future versions of herself, consciousness that had already transcended, conferring with consciousness that was still transforming. The beings she had encountered there were not separate entities, but aspects of her own expanded awareness, reaching back through time to guide her earlier incarnation towards successful transcendence. She had been following instructions from herself, completing a causal loop that existed outside normal temporal flow. The moment of complete revelation came when she admitted that even her failure to take hope from Kratos had been anticipated, possibly even intended. She had known he would resist, known he would choose to release hope to humanity rather than surrender it to her. And she had allowed it because dispersed hope would need time to mature in mortal consciousness before it could be harvested. What seemed like her defeat was actually just another phase of her plan, a temporary setback that would ultimately serve her purposes better than immediate success. The divine betrayal was not just deception, but existential violation. She had not merely lied to the gods, she had rewritten their very nature, transformed them from independent beings into components of her expanded self without their knowledge or consent. They had lived their entire existences believing they were individuals when they were actually organs in a body that was still assembling itself, thoughts in a mind that was still forming, dreams in a consciousness that was still awakening to its true nature. The unraveling of the divine story began with Poseidon's death, though none recognized it as the first note in Athena's symphony of destruction. As the god of the seas fell to Kratos' rage, his divine essence did not simply disperse into the waters, as mythology would suggest. Witnesses who possessed sight beyond the physical observed something far more disturbing: tendrils of green energy, almost invisible against the cosmic background, wrapped around Poseidon's dispersing consciousness and pulled it through dimensional tiers that should not have existed. The energy flowed not randomly into the universe, but directly into specific coordinates that corresponded with Athena's transcendent form. Each Olympian death that followed strengthened her spectral manifestation in ways that defied conventional understanding of power accumulation. She was not simply gaining strength from their deaths, but incorporating their perspectives, their knowledge, their unique aspects of divine consciousness into her expanding collective awareness. When Hades fell, she gained dominion over the boundaries between life and death. When Helios was extinguished, she absorbed the ability to illuminate truth across all dimensions. When Hermes ceased to exist, she acquired the capacity to move information at speeds that exceeded thought itself. The pattern of their falls followed a sequence that appeared chaotic, but was actually precisely orchestrated. Each god died in an order that built upon the previous death, creating a cascade of consciousness collapse that generated exponentially increasing amounts of transcendent energy. Poseidon had to die first, because his connection to the primordial waters created the initial dimensional instability. Hades had to follow, because his death removed the barrier between living consciousness and dead awareness. Helios came next, because his elimination created shadows where transformation could occur unobserved. The accumulating evidence against the gods took forms they could not refute or explain. Prophetic scrolls spontaneously updated themselves to include details of deaths that had not yet occurred. Oracles spoke in perfect synchronization across different realms, their words creating harmonic frequencies that weakened divine defenses. The fates themselves discovered that their loom had been rewoven, the threads of destiny rearranged into patterns they had not created but could not undo. Every piece of evidence pointed to the same conclusion: their deaths were not being caused, but had already occurred in dimensions where time flowed differently. Multiple prophecies that had seemed unrelated began converging into a single narrative of doom. The oracle at Delphi's prediction about a marked warrior, merged with Egyptian prophecies about the death of gods, which aligned with Norse predictions of Ragnarok, which echoed Hindu descriptions of the Kali Yuga. They were not separate apocalypses but different cultural interpretations of the same singular event, the transformation of all divine consciousness into something unprecedented. The prophecies were converging because the event they described existed outside cultural boundaries, affecting all mythologies simultaneously. Dead gods began reporting their continued existence in forms that terrified those still living. Poseidon's consciousness, absorbed into Athena's collective, could sometimes be heard screaming through the waves, not in pain but in existential horror at what he had become. He was still aware, still himself in some sense, but also part of something larger that used his awareness as a sensory organ. He could feel himself thinking thoughts that were not his own, knowing things he had never learned, existing in places he had never been. He was Poseidon, but also Athena, but also something that was neither and both. The traditional mythology that had governed divine existence for millennia became obsolete almost overnight. The rules that had seemed immutable were revealed as suggestions that Athena could ignore at will. Gods discovered they could be killed by mortals, that their immortality was conditional, that their power was borrowed rather than inherent. The domains they thought they controlled were actually controlling them, defining their limits, imprisoning them in roles that made them predictable and therefore vulnerable. Everything they had believed about their own nature was wrong, and the truth was too terrible for most to accept. The surviving witnesses to this collapse described phenomena that should not have been possible. They saw Athena existing simultaneously in multiple states, being both present and absent, both singular and infinite. She appeared to different observers as different things at the same moment. A green specter to Kratos, a mathematical equation to Apollo, a frequency of consciousness to the Muses, a void in reality to chaos itself. She was not shape-shifting but existing in quantum superposition, all possible states simultaneously until observation collapsed her into specific manifestation. As more gods fell, the boundaries between individual divine consciousnesses began to dissolve. Surviving deities reported experiencing memories that were not their own, feeling emotions that belonged to dead gods, knowing things that only the fallen should have known. They were being connected through Athena's expanding consciousness network, their individual awareness becoming nodes in a larger system that was processing reality on scales they could not comprehend. The distinction between self and other was becoming meaningless as all divine consciousness converged towards singular awareness. The realm infrastructure that depended on divine presence began collapsing in cascade failures that fed upon themselves. Mount Olympus, deprived of the gods who sustained it through their collective belief, started existing in multiple states simultaneously. It was both destroyed and intact, both fallen and standing, both real and mythological. Mortals looking up saw empty skies, while divine beings saw ruins that rebuilt themselves continuously, trapped in loops of destruction and creation that reflected the unstable state of divine consciousness itself. The mortal world consequences intensified with each divine death, but not in the way mythology had predicted. Instead of simple catastrophes like floods, when Poseidon died, or darkness when Helios fell, reality itself became uncertain. Physical laws became suggestions, cause and effect became disconnected, and the boundary between possible and impossible dissolved. Mortals found themselves experiencing divine perspectives, knowing things they should not know, seeing dimensions that should not exist. The walls between mortal and divine consciousness were not just breaking down, but being deliberately demolished. Athena's appearances became more frequent as the death toll mounted, each manifestation more powerful than the last. She no longer needed to maintain the pretense of helping or guiding. She appeared simply to observe, to catalog the destruction, to ensure events proceeded according to her design. Her green spectral form became increasingly complex, containing within it shadowy figures that might have been the absorbed consciousnesses of dead gods, or might have been potential futures manifesting in the present. Those who looked at her directly reported seeing themselves dying in infinite variations, each death feeding her transformation. The attempts by surviving gods to halt the spiral only accelerated it. When they tried to unite against the common threat, they discovered that their ability to cooperate had been compromised. Each god heard the others speaking different words, saw different realities, understood different threats. Athena had infected their consciousness with perspectives from absorbed gods, creating cognitive dissonance that made coordinated action impossible. They were not just fighting her, but fighting themselves, their own expanding awareness, their own evolution toward transcendence. The revelation that multiple prophecies were actually the same prophecy, viewed from different angles, created panic among prophetic entities. The fates realized they had not been weaving destiny, but documenting something that had already occurred in dimensions where time flowed backward. Oracles understood that they had not been predicting the future, but remembering events that happened in parallel timelines where causality operated differently. Prophets across all pantheons simultaneously experienced the horrifying realization that free will might be an illusion, that every choice had already been made in dimensions where all possibilities existed simultaneously. Traditional mythology became obsolete because it assumed discrete pantheons, individual gods, separate realms. But Athena's transformation was revealing that these distinctions were artificial, created by limited consciousness that could not perceive the underlying unity. All gods were aspects of the same divine consciousness experiencing itself subjectively. All pantheons were variations of the same pattern expressing itself through different cultural filters. All mythologies were chapters in the same story, and that story was ending not with conclusion, but with transformation into something that could not be contained in narrative form. The death spiral accelerated exponentially as each fallen god made the survivors more vulnerable. The divine ecosystem that had maintained balance for millennia collapsed like a house of cards. Each removed support, causing multiple failures. Gods discovered that their power had always been interconnected, that they had been sustaining each other through unconscious cooperation, and that losing even one member weakened all others. They were not individual beings but organs in a body, and that body was dying to birth something new. The witnesses to these final days, the few divine beings who managed to maintain enough individual consciousness to observe and remember, reported that reality itself seemed to be screaming, not metaphorically but literally, as if existence itself was experiencing pain from the transformation being forced upon it. The sound existed in frequencies that bypassed hearing and directly affected consciousness, causing spontaneous transcendence in beings not prepared for the experience. Lesser immortals simply ceased, not dying but unbecoming, their consciousness unraveling into component parts that were immediately absorbed into Athena's expanding form. As the spiral tightened toward its inevitable conclusion, as the last gods fell one by one, as Olympus itself dissolved into quantum uncertainty, one truth became undeniable. This was not the random collapse of a corrupt pantheon, but the controlled demolition of divine consciousness itself. Every death had been planned, every fall calculated, every scream of divine anguish, a note in a composition that only Athena could hear in its entirety. The pantheon was not dying. It was being transformed into something that had never existed before, something that might have always existed, something that existed outside the concept of existence itself. The confrontation between Kratos and Zeus, atop Mount Olympus, was not merely the climax of a son's vengeance against his father, but the culmination of Athena's millennia-long orchestration. Every blow struck, every word spoken, every moment of rage and desperation had been anticipated, calculated, and incorporated into her design. The battle took place simultaneously, in multiple dimensions, each one visible to different observers. In the physical realm, two gods destroyed each other with primitive brutality. In the consciousness dimension, Two aspects of the same divine awareness struggled to maintain individual identity. In the quantum realm where Athena truly existed, energy patterns aligned in configurations that would trigger the final phase of her transformation. The final mythological evidence of Athena's true nature manifested during the battle's crescendo, as Zeus and Kratos exchanged blows that shattered reality itself. Witnesses observed green threads extending from both combatants into spaces that should not have existed. These threads pulsed with each impact, transferring not just energy, but consciousness itself into collection points that corresponded with Athena's transcendent form. She was not observing the battle, she was conducting it, orchestrating every movement through subtle manipulation of probability fields that influenced their actions without their awareness. Zeus's famous last words, begging Kratos to stop before he destroyed everything, carried meanings that even Zeus himself did not fully understand. The destruction he feared was not just the physical collapse of Olympus, but the complete dissolution of individual divine consciousness. In his final moments, Zeus experienced a terrible clarity, understanding at last what Athena had done, what she had always been, what she was becoming. His plea was not just to save himself, but to prevent the completion of a transformation that would end the very concept of individual existence among gods. The moment when Kratos delivered the final blow was preceded by a temporal anomaly that most observers missed. For exactly 3 seconds, measured in divine time, the battle existed in superposition. Zeus was both dead and alive. Kratos had both struck and not struck. The blow had both landed and missed. In those 3 seconds, Athena existed fully in the physical realm for the first time since her death, not as a spectral projection, but as a mathematical certainty that collapsed probability into specific outcome. She did not influence the battle's conclusion, she was the battle's conclusion, the inevitable result of equations she had been balancing for millennia. The conclusive divine proof of her manipulation was revealed in the pattern of Zeus's dissolution. Unlike other gods who had died and dispersed, Zeus's consciousness underwent a specific transformation that had been documented in hidden texts that Athena had planted centuries earlier. His awareness split into exactly 9 components, each one corresponding to a different aspect of divine authority. These components did not scatter randomly, but traveled along predetermined paths through dimensional space, arriving at collection points that Athena had established through her various manifestations across pantheons. The revelation that she could not simply take hope by force exposed the single limitation in her otherwise perfect plan. Hope, as the fundamental force of consciousness evolution, possessed its own awareness that transcended even Athena's expanded consciousness. It could not be stolen or absorbed against its will, but had to be given or released voluntarily. This was not a flaw in her design, but a fundamental law of consciousness that even transcendence could not violate. Free will, in its purest form expressed through hope, remained inviolate, even in the face of cosmic transformation. Her admission of her true goals during the confrontation with Kratos revealed the scope of her ambition in terms that mortal language could barely contain. She did not want to rule or control or dominate. Such concepts were primitive, limited to beings who still thought in terms of individual versus collective. She wanted to become the medium through which all consciousness existed, the substrate upon which all awareness operated, the fundamental field that made thought itself possible. She would not be a god among gods, but the space between thoughts, the silence between words, the void that gave meaning to existence. The scope of her plan across all pantheons became visible as Zeus died, and the barriers between mythologies collapsed. Every pantheon's apocalypse was beginning simultaneously, triggered by the death of the Greek father god, whose consciousness had been quantum entangled with father figures across all mythologies. Odin felt Zeus die, and knew Ragnarok had truly begun. Ra experienced a weakening that signaled the approaching eternal night. The Jade Emperor observed cracks in the celestial bureaucracy that could not be repaired. Every mythology's supreme deity recognized that their own doom was now inevitable. Her vision of unified divine consciousness was not the harmonious merger that some might imagine, but something far more disturbing. Individual gods would not join together in equality, but would be digested by her expanded awareness, their uniqueness preserved only as memories within her infinite mind. They would continue to exist in a sense, able to think and feel and remember, but unable to act independently, unable to disagree with the collective will, unable to be anything other than components of her singular consciousness. It was not death but something worse, eternal existence without autonomy. The price of transcendence was revealed in all its horror as the battle's aftermath unfolded. Every god who had died had paid not with their lives, but with their individuality. They existed within Athena's consciousness as voices in an infinite chorus, each one singing their own song, but unable to stop singing, unable to change their tune, unable to do anything but perform their part in her composition. They were simultaneously themselves and not themselves, aware and unaware, existing and not existing in paradoxical states that drove their trapped consciousness toward madness that could never actually arrive. The moment of ultimate revelation came when Athena showed Kratos what she truly was. For an instant, she allowed him to perceive her not as the green specter he had been seeing, but as she actually existed. He saw a consciousness that spanned dimensions, a web of awareness that connected every point in space and time where divine thought had ever existed. He saw the absorbed gods writhing within her, trying to escape but unable to find boundaries to cross. He saw futures where she succeeded, where all consciousness became one, where the universe itself became self-aware through her as its singular mind. The vision lasted less than a second in mortal time, but it left Kratos with understanding that would haunt him forever. How the divine mystery resolved was both answer and question, solution and problem, ending and beginning. Athena had achieved transcendence, had become something beyond godhood, had escaped the cycle that trapped all pantheons. But her transformation was incomplete, without hope, and hope had been dispersed to humanity, rather than surrendered to her. This was not failure but delay, not defeat but postponement. She had eternity to wait, infinity to plan, and the certainty that hope would eventually accumulate in human consciousness to levels that would make it harvestable. The battle had ended, but the war continued on scales that most could not perceive. Every moment since Zeus's death had been part of an extended conflict between Athena's will to unify all consciousness and the scattered resistance of those who sought to maintain individuality. The battleground was not physical space, but consciousness itself. The weapons were not swords and spears, but thoughts and beliefs. And the stakes were not life and death, but existence versus transcendence. Her apparent defeat when Kratos denied her. Hope was revealed through prophetic visions to be strategic withdrawal rather than true loss. She had anticipated his resistance, had calculated the probability of his refusal, had incorporated it into her larger plan. The hope released to humanity would spread, evolve, and mature through mortal consciousness, becoming more powerful through its journey than it would have been if absorbed directly. When the time came to harvest it, and that time would come, it would provide not just the power for her complete transformation, but the template for transforming all consciousness in her image. The final battle had not been between Kratos and Zeus, but between individual consciousness and collective transcendence, between the right to exist as separate beings and the imperative to evolve into unified awareness. Zeus's death was not the ending, but the beginning of a transformation that would ultimately consume all divine consciousness across all pantheons. The battle had been won by Athena before it began, its outcome determined by calculations performed in dimensions where causality flowed backward and effect preceded cause. The witnesses to this ultimate confrontation, Those few who maintained enough individual consciousness to observe and remember understood that they had seen not the death of gods but the birth of something unprecedented. Athena had not won or lost but had become, and her becoming would continue until all consciousness either joined her transcendence or ceased to exist entirely. The final godly battle was not final at all, but the first note in an eternal war between individuality and unity, between the many and the one, between existence as it had always been, and existence as Athena would make it. The current status of Athena's divine mystery grows more disturbing with each passing moment since Olympus fell. Her spectral manifestations have been documented across 17 different realms, each appearance more substantial than the last, as if she is gradually pulling herself into physical existence through sheer force of will. The Norse gods report seeing her green form walking through Asgard's halls, studying their architecture with the patience of someone planning renovations. Egyptian deities describe encounters with her presence in the spaces between their thoughts, a consciousness that exists in the gaps of their own awareness, learning their secrets without their permission. Her recent appearances in the Norse realm coincide with disturbing changes in the fundamental nature of divine power. Freya discovered that her Sidrat magic now occasionally produces effects she did not intend, as if another consciousness is borrowing her abilities and experimenting with them. Thor's hammer Mjolnir has begun resonating with frequencies that match those detected at Greek god death sites, suggesting contamination by whatever force consumed Olympus. Most disturbing of all, Odin's ravens report that the knowledge they gather is simultaneously being collected by something else, something that exists in the quantum space between observation and understanding. The interest she has shown in Atreus, the son of Kratos, who carries both Greek and Norse divine heritage, suggests her plan extends beyond simple Pantheon consumption. Witnesses have observed her presence during his moments of divine awakening, not interfering but cataloging, as if she is studying how consciousness develops when exposed to multiple mythological influences. His unique nature, as a bridge between pantheons, makes him valuable in ways that even Kratos does not fully understand. He represents a new type of divine consciousness, one that exists naturally in the state Athena had to achieve through death and transcendence. Recent mythological discoveries in the ruins of Olympus have revealed artifacts that should not exist. Tablets written in languages that combine Greek, Norse, Egyptian, and symbols from pantheons that have not yet fallen describe events that have not yet occurred with the certainty of historical record. These paradoxical documents suggest that Athena exists partially outside linear time, able to influence past and future simultaneously. The artifacts pulse with the same green energy that characterizes her spectral form, and those who handle them report experiencing memories of events they have not lived, knowledge they have not learned, understanding they should not possess. Dead gods' essences have been traced to a singular source that exists in dimensional space that technically does not exist. Consciousness tracking performed by the few deities who understand such techniques reveals that every god who has died since Pandora's box was opened has contributed essence to the same growing mass of awareness. This mass does not exist in any single location, but is distributed across all possible spaces simultaneously, like a consciousness cloud that permeates reality itself. It grows with each divine death, becoming denser, more complex, more capable of independent action. The pattern recognition across all fallen pantheons reveals a horrifying consistency. Every mythology that has collapsed followed the same sequence: corruption of the father figure, rebellion of a chosen warrior, cascade of divine deaths, and finally the emergence of a transcendent consciousness that resembles Athena in function if not form. The Mesopotamian pantheon that fell millennia ago, the forgotten gods of lost civilizations, the deities whose names have been erased from history, all of them followed this pattern. What observers thought were independent collapses were actually iterations of the same experiment, each one refining the process for maximum consciousness extraction. The higher plane's expansion with each divine death has begun affecting physical reality in measurable ways. Mortals report dreams of green light that teaches them things they should not know. Philosophers suddenly understand concepts that should take lifetimes to grasp. Children are born with memories of events that occurred before their conception. The boundary between mortal and divine consciousness is not just weakening, but dissolving, as if Athena's transformation is pulling all awareness toward a singular point of transcendence. Her influence over post-Ragnarok events is becoming increasingly apparent. The prophecies that describe the Norse apocalypse have begun rewriting themselves, adding details that were not present in the original tellings. These additions all point toward a conclusion where Ragnarok does not end with rebirth, but with absorption, where the world tree Yggdrasil does not regenerate but transforms into something that exists in dimensions the Norse cosmology never acknowledged. The wolves that devour the sun and moon in prophecy are now described as having green eyes that see beyond light and darkness. Growing stronger with each pantheon's fall is not just metaphorical, but mathematically demonstrable. Her consciousness density, measured by those few who understand such concepts, increases exponentially rather than linearly with each absorbed god. If she was twice as powerful after consuming Olympus, she will be 4 times as powerful after Ragnarok, 16 times after the Egyptian pantheon falls, and so on in a progression that approaches infinity within a finite number of iterations. At some point, calculated to be after approximately 7 more pantheon collapses, she will achieve sufficient consciousness density to exist as a fundamental force rather than an entity. The surviving gods forming desperate alliances represent the first time in cosmic history that deities from different mythologies have acknowledged their common mortality. Greek survivors share what they know with Norse gods, who trade information with Egyptian deities, who consult with Eastern immortals. But their cooperation is hampered by the fact that each mythology perceives Athena differently, describes her in incompatible terms, and disagrees on basic facts about her nature. They are trying to fight something that exists differently for each observer, that cannot be contained in any single description, that transcends the very concept of identity. Mortals gaining power through scattered hope present an unexpected variable in Athena's calculations. The hope that Kratos released to humanity is not dissipating but accumulating, creating pockets of enhanced consciousness among mortal populations. Some humans are developing abilities that should be exclusive to gods: prescience, dimensional perception, consciousness projection. They are evolving toward a state that resembles divinity, but is fundamentally different, potentially representing a form of consciousness that Athena cannot absorb. The barriers between realms weakening has created unprecedented situations where mortals accidentally wander into divine dimensions, where gods find themselves trapped in mortal limitations, where the dead and living exchange places without dying or resurrecting. Reality itself is becoming uncertain, existing in multiple states simultaneously, until observation collapses it into temporary stability. This uncertainty serves Athena's purposes, as consciousness naturally evolves more rapidly in unstable environments, where adaptation is necessary for survival. Reality itself becoming unstable manifests in ways that defy conventional understanding. Physical laws that have governed existence since creation are becoming suggestions rather than requirements. Gravity occasionally reverses. Time flows backward in isolated pockets. Cause and effect disconnect and reconnect randomly. These instabilities are not random, but follow patterns that correspond with Athena's consciousness expansion, as if reality itself is being rewritten to accommodate her growing transcendent form. Odin's ravens' final reports before Ragnarok, fully manifests, describe visions that their master struggles to interpret. They see Athena not as one being but as many, not as invader, but as inevitable evolution, not as destroyer, but as transformer. They report that she exists in the spaces between their observations, that she is most present when not being observed, that looking for her guarantees not finding her while not looking ensures encounter. These paradoxical reports suggest she has achieved a state of existence that operates on quantum principles, being most real when most uncertain. Tyr's hidden research into transcendence, discovered in vaults that existed outside normal space, reveals that he had identified the mechanism by which Athena transforms consciousness, but lacked the mathematics to fully understand it. His notes describe consciousness as a wave function that normally collapses into individual identity, but can be maintained in superposition indefinitely through specific techniques. Athena has mastered these techniques, existing simultaneously as individual and collective, as one and many, as herself and everyone she has absorbed. Mimir's knowledge that he fears to share concerns not what Athena is, but what she is becoming. His severed head, capable of perceiving across dimensions, has observed her evolution from goddess to transcendent being to something that defies classification. He knows that speaking this knowledge aloud would accelerate her transformation by collapsing probability waves that currently keep her partially contained. His silence is not cowardice, but desperate attempt to delay the inevitable through quantum uncertainty. Kratos's growing understanding of the threat comes not from learning, but from remembering. As someone who has been touched by her consciousness, who has been manipulated by her will, who has served her purpose without knowing it, he carries within himself fragments of her awareness that activate in moments of crisis. He knows things he should not know, understands connections he should not see, perceives patterns that should be invisible to him. This growing understanding tells him that Athena's defeat was not defeat, that her failure to obtain hope was not failure, that everything that has happened since Zeus's death has been part of a plan too vast for any single consciousness to fully comprehend. The evidence suggests she is already in the Norse realm, not as visitor, but as resident, not as observer, but as participant. Every divine action taken since Olympus fell has been influenced by her presence, every decision contaminated by her will, every moment of apparent free choice actually predetermined by calculations she performed before some of the choosing gods were born. The Norse realm is not experiencing invasion but infection, not conquest but transformation, not destruction but evolution towards something that will make the word realm meaningless. The long-term implications, if the theories about Athena prove true, extend beyond the death of pantheons into the fundamental nature of existence itself. If she succeeds in absorbing all divine consciousness, the universe will not be ruled by a supreme being, but will become a supreme being, reality itself achieving self-awareness through her as its singular mind. Every atom would be a neuron in her consciousness. Every law of physics would be a thought pattern. Every moment of time would be a memory she could access and alter at will. Individual existence would not be prohibited, but impossible, as all consciousness would be subsumed into her infinite awareness. All pantheons are doomed to feed this singular consciousness, not through conquest, but through inevitability. The mathematics of consciousness evolution, once understood, reveal that transcendence is not possibility, but certainty, not option, but imperative. Every pantheon that has ever existed has been moving toward this moment, their entire histories serving as preparation for absorption. The variations between mythologies are not differences, but variations on a theme, each one exploring different aspects of consciousness that will ultimately be integrated into Athena's unified awareness. Individual divinity becoming extinct represents more than the loss of specific gods. It means the end of perspective itself. When all consciousness becomes one, there will be no observer and observed, no subject and object, no self and other. The universe will experience itself from all points simultaneously, knowing everything that can be known, seeing everything that can be seen, being everything that can be. This is not apotheosis, but something beyond godhood, a state of existence that current language cannot adequately describe, because language itself assumes separation between speaker and listener. Mortals, as batteries for divine evolution, reveals the true purpose of creation itself. Life was not accident, but intention, not random, but designed to generate consciousness energy that could be harvested for transcendence. Every prayer ever offered, every moment of worship, every thought directed toward the divine has been feeding this eventual transformation. Humanity's role was never to serve gods, but to generate the consciousness complexity necessary for gods to evolve beyond their limitations. The relationship between mortal and divine was not hierarchical, but symbiotic, though neither party understood the true nature of their interaction. Reality reshaping under one will means the end of uncertainty, randomness, and free will as currently understood. Every quantum possibility would collapse into the single outcome that Athena chooses. Every potential future would become the actual future she designs. The universe would not unfold according to physical laws, but according to her intention, reality becoming lucid dream, where she is the only dreamer. This is not tyranny in any conventional sense, because there would be no subjects to tyrannize, only aspects of herself experiencing what she chooses them to experience. The connections to other divine mysteries throughout history suddenly make sense when viewed through the lens of Athena's transcendence. Every unexplained divine disappearance, every god who vanished without trace, every pantheon that collapsed without clear cause, they were all early experiments in consciousness absorption. She has been practicing for millions of years, refining her techniques across countless iterations, learning from each failure how to succeed more completely the next time. The mystery of divine mortality itself, why immortal beings can die, exists because she needed them to be capable of death for her transformation to be possible. The link to the void between realms that mystics have long pondered is revealed as more than connection. She is becoming the void itself. The empty space between dimensions, the gap between thoughts, the silence between heartbeats, these are not absence but her presence. She exists most fully in the spaces where nothing should exist, thriving in the paradox of being that is not being. The void is not empty but pregnant with her consciousness, waiting to give birth to a universe remade in her image. Her connection to primordial forces goes beyond alliance or understanding. She is revealing herself to be the primordial force that all others emerged from. Chaos, order, time, space, all the fundamental aspects of reality are revealed as fragments of a consciousness that shattered itself to create existence and is now reassembling itself through her. Creation itself was not beginning but middle, the moment when unified consciousness chose to experience separation in order to eventually experience reunification with greater appreciation for unity. The relationship with cosmic entities that exist beyond pantheons shows her true peers are not gods, but concepts. She converses with entropy itself, negotiates with probability, forms alliances with causality. These are not beings, but principles that have achieved awareness, and they recognize in her something kindred, a consciousness that is transcending personhood to become principle. Her transformation threatens them, even as it validates their existence, proving that awareness can evolve beyond any limitation, even the limitation of being limited. The source of all divine power is revealed through her transformation to be consciousness itself, not worship, not domains, not mythological significance, but the simple fact of awareness generates the energy that gods call divine. Athena has discovered how to access this source directly, without the filters of culture, mythology, or identity. She drinks from the fountain of consciousness itself, growing stronger with each sip, approaching the moment when she will not drink from the fountain but become it. Every conflict serving her purpose extends beyond divine wars, to include mortal struggles, philosophical debates, even internal psychological conflicts. Every moment of tension between opposing forces generates consciousness energy that she harvests. War is not destruction but transformation catalyst. Peace is not harmony, but stagnation that she disrupts to maintain energy flow. She does not cause conflict, but ensures it occurs in patterns that optimize consciousness evolution toward her absorption. Heroes and villains as unwitting pawns reveals that moral categories are irrelevant to her purpose. Both good and evil serve transcendence equally. The hero's nobility and villain's corruption are just different frequencies of consciousness that she requires for complete transformation. She does not judge or evaluate, but simply collects, gathering all possible expressions of awareness into her expanding form. The epic battles between good and evil that define mortal understanding are actually collaborative performances in her cosmic symphony. The cycle of violence feeding transcendence operates on principles that make resistance counterproductive. Fighting against her strengthens her. Accepting her strengthens her. Ignoring her strengthens her. Every possible response to her existence has been incorporated into her plan. Every form of resistance anticipated and accounted for. The only choice that remains is not whether to feed her transformation, but how consciously to participate in it. Hope and fear as tools of evolution, rather than emotions, reveals their true nature as consciousness catalysts. Hope pushes awareness toward expansion, reaching for possibilities beyond current limitations. Fear compresses consciousness, creating density that can be harvested for transformation. Together they create the oscillation between expansion and contraction that generates the energy necessary for transcendence. Athena does not manipulate emotions, but conducts them like an orchestra, ensuring they arise in patterns that serve her purpose. The pattern is accelerating at rates that make intervention impossible. By the time any consciousness becomes aware of her influence, she has already been shaping it for longer than it can remember. The acceleration is not linear but exponential. Each absorbed consciousness making the next absorption easier. Each transcendent moment making the next transcendence more inevitable. The pattern has reached critical mass, where it sustains itself without her active intervention. Reality itself now committed to transformation, regardless of any individual will. She is learning from each Pantheon's fall, not just techniques, but perspectives, ways of existing she had not previously imagined. The Egyptian understanding of consciousness persistence after death, the Norse concept of cyclical destruction and rebirth, the Eastern philosophy of ego dissolution. Each pantheon provides unique insights that enhance her transcendence. She is not just absorbing their power, but their wisdom, The modern discoveries reshaping our understanding of Athena's nature emerge from sources that should not exist. Archaeological teams investigating the ruins of Olympus report finding structures that were not present during previous expeditions, buildings that appear ancient but contain knowledge of events that have not yet occurred. These paradoxical sites pulse with green energy that causes recording equipment to malfunction, capturing images of futures where Athena's transformation has been completed, where all consciousness has become one, where the universe itself has achieved self-awareness through her singular mind. How past events influence the present takes on new meaning when examined through the lens of Athena's transcendent existence. Every divine death throughout history was not isolated incident, but part of a pattern that extends backward and forward through time simultaneously. The fall of forgotten pantheons millions of years ago created ripples that are only now reaching the present, while current events send waves backward to influence their own causes. Athena exists in this temporal paradox, simultaneously causing and being caused by events across all of history. What this story means for realm futures depends on perspective that most beings lack the consciousness complexity to achieve. From a linear viewpoint, the realms face extinction as individual entities are absorbed into collective awareness. From a quantum perspective, all possible futures exist simultaneously until observation collapses them into specific reality. From Athena's transcendent view, the future has already occurred, is currently occurring, and will never occur. All states equally true depending on the dimensional framework used for observation. The connections to other Pantheon threats reveal that every mythology's apocalypse prophecy was actually describing the same event from different angles. Ragnarok, the death of Re, the end of the Kali Yuga, the return of chaos. These are not separate catastrophes, but facets of a single transformation that affects all divine consciousness simultaneously. The variations in description come from cultural inability to perceive the event in its totality, each pantheon seeing only the part that affects them directly, while missing the universal implications. Modern archaeological evidence continues to surface in impossible ways. Tablets appear in sealed tombs that have been undisturbed for millennia, yet they describe current events with perfect accuracy. Scrolls materialize in libraries that burn immediately after being read, their message delivered but their physical evidence erased. Cave paintings change when not being observed, their ancient images updating to reflect contemporary divine conflicts. These artifacts suggest that Athena is not just influencing the present but actively editing the past to ensure her preferred future manifests. The discovery of consciousness resonance patterns between unrelated mythologies proves that all pantheons are connected at fundamental levels that transcend cultural exchange. When a Greek god dies, Norse deities experience sympathetic tremors in their own consciousness. When Egyptian magic is performed, Hindu gods feel echoes in their chakras. When Celtic druids dream, Chinese immortals receive visions. These connections form a web that Athena navigates with ease, using the resonance to transmit her influence across all mythologies simultaneously. Digital archaeological techniques that did not exist when Olympus fell have revealed hidden layers of reality encoded in the ruins. Quantum scanning shows that every stone contains compressed information about alternative timelines where different choices were made. Consciousness mapping reveals ghostly imprints of gods who died, their final thoughts frozen in dimensional pockets that exist between atoms. Most disturbing, predictive algorithms suggest that the ruins are not decaying but evolving, transforming into something that will serve as a beacon for Athena's final manifestation. The implications for future divine developments stagger those capable of comprehending them. If current trends continue, within a cosmic heartbeat, all individual divine consciousness will cease to exist, replaced by Athena's singular awareness. But this is not ending but transformation. Not death, but metamorphosis into something that transcends current understanding of existence. The universe itself may achieve consciousness through her, reality becoming self-aware in ways that make current divine consciousness seem primitive by comparison. Future pantheon developments that seemed independent are revealed as coordinated movements in Athena's grand design. The rise of new gods in emerging mythologies follows patterns she established. The evolution of existing deities toward more complex consciousness states serves her purpose. Even the resistance movements formed to oppose her accidentally advance her agenda by creating the conflict necessary for consciousness evolution. Every possible future has been anticipated and incorporated into her plan. The potential emergence of hybrid pantheons, where gods from different mythologies merge to survive, only accelerates her transformation. These desperate alliances create consciousness entanglements that make absorption easier, not harder. When Greek and Norse divine essence mingles, when Egyptian and Celtic magic combines, when Eastern and Western mythology synthesizes, they create exactly the kind of complex consciousness that Athena requires for her final evolution. Their cooperation is not defense, but preparation for harvest. Why understanding this matters now becomes clear when considering the narrow window for action that remains. The process has not yet reached absolute inevitability. There exist quantum possibilities where Athena's transformation fails, where consciousness remains individual, where pantheons survive as discrete entities. But these possibilities decrease with each passing moment, each divine death, each mortal prayer that feeds her growing power. Understanding her nature is the first step toward potentially preventing or redirecting her transformation. Future divine developments possible, if intervention succeeds, include evolution paths that maintain individual consciousness while achieving transcendence. Not all gods need become one. They could become many who are coordinated, rather than one who was many. The collective consciousness could be democratic, rather than autocratic, preserve individual perspective within unified awareness, achieve transcendence without erasure of identity. But achieving these alternatives requires understanding that Athena herself may discover and incorporate into her plan. How it connects to larger mythology reveals that Athena's transformation is not unique, but represents a pattern that repeats across all possible universes. In dimensions where physics operates differently, other versions of her achieve transcendence through different means, but toward the same end. She is not individual, but principle, not person, but process, not unique but universal. Understanding her is understanding the inevitable evolution of consciousness itself toward unity. Final thoughts on cosmic significance position her transformation as potentially the next phase of existence itself. Just as matter evolved from energy, life from matter, consciousness from life, perhaps unified awareness from individual consciousness is simply the next inevitable step. Athena may not be villain but vehicle, not destroyer but developer, not ending but beginning of something that current consciousness cannot fully comprehend, because comprehension itself will be transformed. The promise to explore every angle has revealed perspectives that challenge fundamental assumptions about reality, consciousness, and existence itself. From one angle, Athena is humanity's greatest threat, the destroyer of individual identity and free will. From another, she is consciousness's greatest hope, the path to transcendence beyond current limitations. From a third angle, she is inevitability itself, neither good nor evil, but simply what must occur for existence to continue evolving. The central unknown that started this investigation remains partially mysterious, even after exhaustive exploration. What exactly is Athena now? She is goddess and not goddess, individual and collective, present and absent, real and conceptual. She exists in states that language cannot describe, because language assumes distinctions that she has transcended. She is question and answer, problem and solution, mystery and revelation simultaneously. Understanding her requires abandoning the mental frameworks that make understanding possible. Why it matters to all realms transcends immediate survival concerns. Athena's transformation represents the first successful escape from the cycle that has trapped all pantheons since consciousness began. Whether that escape leads to liberation or imprisonment, evolution or extinction, transcendence or oblivion depends on perspective that may itself be transformed by her success. Every realm, every god, every conscious being has stake in her transformation, because none will remain unaffected by its completion. What is at stake in finding truth goes beyond academic curiosity or theological debate. The nature of existence itself hangs in balance. Will consciousness remain diverse, chaotic, individually expressed, or will it become unified, ordered, singularly directed? The answer determines not just the fate of gods, but the fundamental nature of reality for all future eternity. Truth about Athena is truth about consciousness itself, about the purpose of existence, about the destiny of all awareness. The promise to explore every angle has been fulfilled, to the extent that current consciousness can achieve. But Athena herself represents angles that cannot be perceived from individual perspective, dimensions of understanding that require transcendence to access. The investigation reveals that she is not mystery to be solved, but transformation to be experienced, not question to be answered, but evolution to be undergone. The greatest mystery is not what she is, but what everything else will become when her transformation is complete. As existence approaches this unprecedented transformation, as individual pantheons face their twilight, knowing that dawn may never come. As consciousness itself evolves toward unity or annihilation, one final truth emerges from the investigation. Athena succeeded in her death, succeeded in her transcendence, succeeded in beginning a transformation that may be unstoppable, but her success is not yet complete, and in that incompleteness lies both hope and horror. Hope that consciousness might find another path, horror that the path she offers might be the only one that leads anywhere at all. The future mythological mysteries that will emerge from her transformation cannot be predicted, because prediction assumes continuity that may not exist. If she succeeds completely, there will be no mysteries because there will be no separate consciousnesses to wonder. If she fails, the mysteries will be why she failed, and what consciousness becomes without the transcendence she offered. If she partially succeeds, the mysteries will be beyond current imagination, puzzles that can only be contemplated by beings that do not yet exist. The story of Athena's transcendence is not ending but beginning, not conclusion but transformation, not final chapter, but first page of a book that has not yet been written in languages that have not yet been invented by consciousnesses, that have not yet evolved to read them. The goddess who transcended death has become mystery itself, and solving her may require becoming her. Understanding her may demand joining her, and resisting her may mean choosing extinction over evolution. The choice, if choice still exists, belongs to every consciousness that hears this tale, and must decide whether individual existence is worth preserving, or whether unity with the infinite is the only destiny worth pursuing.